Introduction. Holistic health can be a hard sell in today's marketplace. As addressed in detail in Chapter 1, the wealthy medical pharmaceutical industry has launched a sustained campaign to discredit any person, modality, substance, or idea that threatens its power and profits. Drug companies publish skewed research, denigrating simple, time-honored remedies while distorting laboratory results for new medicines, making them appear safer and more effective than they actually are. Many people today are not aware of a major clash, nearly 200 years ago, between two French scientists, one representing Big Pharma and the other representing holism. Once you learn the central issues behind this debate, who won it and why, you will understand the scope of Royal Rife's technology and why this technology was so difficult for some people to accept. Life cycles of a microbe, Béchamp versus Pasteur. For almost 2 centuries, citizens worldwide have grown up fearing dangerous microorganisms that lurk in our air, water, and food, causing infection and plague in hapless victims. That is because the clash of 2 centuries ago was won by the famous French chemist Louis Pasteur. Pasteur, in hypothesizing how people get sick, promoted what became known as his germ theory of disease. Basically, the theory states that bacteria, viruses, and fungi are potent and unchanging. They invade the person from an outside particular disease. A particular microbe causes a particular disease, and once we wipe out the germ with medicine, we banish the disease and create health. Most people do not know that Pasteur's germ theory is based on flawed, if not outright falsified, research. Most people recognize the name of Pasteur, for it was he who championed the widespread process of heating milk to temperatures high enough to destroy microbes. Indeed, the process is named pasteurization in his honor. What is less well known is that the process is not as beneficial as we have been led to believe, and in fact, damages a food to the point where tea is actually dangerous. See Chapter 3 for more details on milk. Furthermore, very few people are aware that of the legitimate ideas and discoveries that Pasteur did present to the world, many were stolen from a far more brilliant rival, a doctor and pharmacologist named Pierre-Jacques-Antoine Béchamp, born 1816. The two men were quite different in intellect, training, competence, and temperament. Pasteur had no training in the biological or medical sciences and never obtained credentials beyond his chemistry background. He barely passed his exams. Béchamp held many degrees and titles. Among these were Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Science, Master of Pharmacy, Professor of Medical Chemistry and Pharmacy at the Faculty of Medicine, Montpellier University, Professor of Biological Chemistry, Fellow and Professor of Physics and Toxicology, and Dean of the Free Faculty of Medicine at the University of Lille, France. Among Béchamp's many achievements was the development of an inexpensive way to produce the chemical aniline for France's dye manufacturers. He also saved the silk industry in France from ruin by finding the causes and cures for 2 diseases that were devastating the silkworm population. Although Pasteur wrote in a correspondence to a colleague, "They have never even touched silkworm," he later claimed credit for having single-handedly rescued the silk industry, a claim so well publicized that Pasteur was believed due to sheer repetition. The two men were quite different in intellect, training, competence, and temperament. Pasteur had no training in the biological or medical sciences and never obtained credentials beyond his chemistry background. He barely passed his exams. Béchamp held many degrees and titles. Among these were Doctor of Medicine, Doctor of Science, Master of Pharmacy, Professor of Medical Chemistry and Pharmacy at the Faculty of Medicine, Montpellier University, Professor of Biological Chemistry, Fellow and Professor of Physics and Toxicology, and Dean of the Free Faculty of Medicine at the University of Lille, France. Among Béchamp's many achievements was the development of an inexpensive way to produce the chemical aniline for France's dye manufacturers. He also saved the silk industry in France from ruin by finding the causes and cures for 2 diseases that were devastating the silkworm population. Although Pasteur wrote in a correspondence to a colleague, "I have never even touched silkworm," to he later claimed credit for having single-handedly rescued the silk industry, a claim so well publicized that Pasteur was believed due to sheer repetition. Some of Béchamp's work that Pasteur plagiarized was even submitted to the French Academy of Science in Pasteur's name. Science biographer Edith Douglas Hume chronicles in great detail how Pasteur's own experiments sometimes contradicted his conclusions. She also explains that various chemical procedures suggested to French by Pasteur winemakers and other industry heads were abandoned after they learned that his suggestions would not work. Despite Béchamp's encyclopedic scientific contributions, his name and accomplishments have been nearly obliterated from history, while the name and achievements of Louis Pasteur are revered. An ironic twist to this tale is that although Pasteur stole scientifically accurate data from Béchamp, it was sometimes so contaminated by Pasteur's own inaccurate theories that many improvements contributed by Béchamp were offset or erased. Perhaps Pasteur's greatest offense was to replace Béchamp's solid evidence about the origin and nature of microbes with what we call the germ theory. This popular fiction quickly became regarded as irrefutable fact by mainstream scientists and medical doctors. I will discuss the flawed germ theory in a moment, but first, it is worth exploring a bit how this theory became construed as absolute fact. The answer then, as now, has a lot to do with publicity and politics. Hume writes of Louis Pasteur that intense strength of will, acute worldly wisdom, and unflagging ambition were the prominent traits of his character. By contrast, Antoine Béchamp was utterly indifferent to personal ambition. Never of a pushing temperament, he made no effort to seek out influential acquaintances and advertise his successes to them. Self-oblivious, he was entirely concentrated upon nature and its mysteries, never resting till something of these should be revealed. Self-glorification never occurred to him, and while the doings of Pasteur were being made public property, Béchamp shut in his quiet laboratory, was immersed in discoveries, which were simply published later in scientific records without being heralded by self-advertisement. The medical doctor who wrote the foreword to Béchamp's own volume, The Blood and Its Third Anatomical Element, points out that one of Pasteur's promoters was the Research Advancement Society in England, an organization which exists for the purpose of popularizing experiments on animals. Pasteur discovered that if one gets into the limelight and has enough push, money, and political power to back him, his name can be immortalized. If Béchamp was such an obviously superior and credentialed scientist, why were so many ready to believe Pasteur? The answer, unfortunately then as now, is image. Pasteur was a much better public speaker than Béchamp. Pasteur's more imposing and impressive presence is a good illustration of the extent to which social status determines what becomes regarded as science. Also, powerful economic interests, including the chemical companies, were making money from Pasteur's fables, so they continued to help suppress Béchamp's discoveries and work. By the time of Pasteur's death, the germ theory was firmly entrenched in people's consciousness, propelled by a momentum of its own. Although Béchamp's discoveries and research seem extraordinary on one level, they were based on common sense, as they explained so many apparent anomalies in medicine. In every living entity, the scientist discovered, exists basic unit smaller than a cell, autonomous, living, molecular structure he named microzyma, from the Greek words meaning small and ferment. Rather than being harmful, Béchamp wrote, microzymas function as anatomical elements in the living and healthy organism. There they are the physiological and chemical agents of the transformations which take place during the process of nutrition. In other words, microzymas are responsible for building cell tissue. In fact, they provide many useful services until the terrain of the body changes and the tissues begin to degenerate. At that point, the microzymas change form and function according to their new environment. Altered microzymas comprise approximately a dozen different families consisting either of bacteria, viruses, or fungi. However, there is a hierarchy of appearance and structure among these pathogens. A bacterium is considered to be the first pathogenic change in a diseased body, and a fungal form is the last. This order of emergence and hierarchy of sophistication may be one reason that bacterial infections are easier to eliminate than fungal infections. The body is not as far along in its process of deterioration. Note that the bacteria referred to here are pathogenic, and not the essential microorganisms such as Acidophilus and Bifidus that live in the intestinal tract and help us digest our food. Beneficial intestinal flora thrive and proliferate only under those conditions that favor our own health. Pathogenic microzymas further ferment unhealthy tissue, disintegrating it into its more elemental calm. The microzymas actively catalyze the total components destruction of an organism without being destroyed themselves. When there is no more tissue, they revert back to their harmless state. Béchamp demonstrated this process by conducting an experiment with a dead cat encased in natural limestone and thus protected from exposure to the air. After several years, the cat was completely decomposed by bacteria, which returned to their microzyma state after they completed their scavenger job. This experiment was repeatable. One author succinctly describes this process. The bacteria found in man and animals do not cause disease. They have the same function as those found in the soil, or in sewage, or elsewhere in nature. They are there to rebuild dead or diseased tissues, or rework body wastes, and it is well known that they will not or cannot attack healthy tissues. Body tissues are healthy when they receive the proper nutrients. If there are no assimilable nutrients available for an adequate period of time, cells starve. In a state of starvation, the cells lose their vitality and ability to function, and they decompose into diseased tissue, unable to support growth. Once this occurs, the microzymas transmute and are first on the scene to perform their cleanup. Contributors to disease. There are several important contributors to disease. I say contributors rather than causes, because illness is comprised of many interrelated factors rather than one or two linear causes that lead to effects. Nutritional deficiencies. Nutrient starvation is due to poor quality food. Most people eat an unbalanced diet, consisting largely of processed food loaded with artificial additives, but it's doubtful whether some items sold to eat should be called food at all. These include refined sugars, such as table sugar, refined carbohydrates, white breads and pastries made from denatured grains, artificial chemical preservatives, flavorings and dyes, unfermented or improperly fermented soy products, coffee and soda, so-called junk food, such as manufactured dried snacks and chips, pasteurized and homogenized dairy, and most vegetable oils. A better term for such items is fake food. Fake foods do not give the body what it needs to maintain its vitality. They also strip the system of valuable nutrients and add compounds that are harmful, so you end up depleting your system even more. Improper diet hinders the body's ability to resist internal and external insults and injuries. For a detailed discussion, see Chapter 3. Sleep deficit. Getting about 8 hours of sleep a night is crucial. The body uses the time to repair itself. Waste removal continues even more efficiently since tasks that are normally done during waking hours have been set aside. Vital functions such as heartbeat and respiration slow to a minimum. Even the brain is working to restore itself and promote memory retention. Illness, nutrient starvation, and irregular lifestyle habits can all contribute to lack of sleep. Conversely, when we don't get enough sleep, and especially if sleep deficit continues over a period of days, months, and years, we lay the foundation for vastly reduced functioning and even illness. For a detailed discussion on the benefits of sleep, the effects of sleep deprivation, and suggestions on how to get a good night's sleep, see Chapter 3. Oxygen insufficiency. Oxygen scarcity is a serious problem. Not only would we die without it, but our tissues require oxygen for repair. Also, most pathogenic microbes thrive in an anaerobic, oxygen-deprived environment. Although so-called oxygen therapy is used in the United States to help ease conditions such as asthma and emphysema, the modality is much more sophisticated in other forms. In many countries outside the U.S., oxygen therapies consist of pure medical-grade ozone, food-grade hydrogen peroxide, and hyperbaric oxygen chambers. Each provides significant benefits when used properly. Chapter 3 discusses in detail the history of oxygen therapies, how and why they work, and to administer them yourself. Chemical toxicity. Toxin literally means poison. Any substance that stresses the system's biochemistry to the extent that cell structure and organ function are negatively affected may be considered a poison. Chapter 1 addressed in detail the effects of foreign chemicals we call drugs. But there are literally tons of other chemicals that are so commonly used, many people do not regard them as dangerous foreign agents. These agents enter the body through the skin, respiratory tract, and gastrointestinal tract. The following excerpt from my book, The Holistic Handbook of Sauna Therapy, very briefly describes the number of dangerous chemicals in our environment. These chemicals include pesticides, fertilizers, and volatile organic compounds, VOCs, among which are formaldehyde, toluene, benzene, and styrene. These are found in antifreeze, carpet, disinfectant, laundry detergent, polishes and varnish, shampoo, even packaged foods. Heavy metals, also known as toxic metals, also find their way into the body. Cadmium, lead, mercury, and zinc in cleaners, cosmetics, paint, solvents, vaccinations, and thousands of other items. Detergents, heavy metals, and solvents abound in cleaners, soaps, and personal care products. Hydrocarbons and sulfur dioxide are in automobile, bus, and airplane exhaust. Carpet contains acetone, benzene and ethylbenzene, formaldehyde, phthalate, styrene, toluene, and xylene, in addition to heavy metals that give them their bright color. Clothing is treated with fire retardant and fabric softener. Computers, telephones, electronic devices, and thousands of other things outgas molecules of plastic. Deodorizers and mothballs are made from dangerous petrochemicals. Fertilizers also contain petrochemicals. Furniture, glue, and adhesives contain solvents. Pesticides, insecticides, fumigants, and fungicides, purposely made to be deadly, are registered poisons with the United States government. They are sprayed onto our crops and now are embedded in cooking utensils and children's toys. Shoe polish is comprised of dyes synthesized from coal tar, which in turn is derived from petroleum. Secondhand cigarette smoke alone contains, among other chemicals, acetone, acetylene, ammonia, benzene, carbon monoxide, DDT, formaldehyde, heavy metals, hydrogen cyanide, methane, methyl alcohol, nickel compounds, nicotine, and propane. It is almost impossible to avoid chemicals. Our bodies act like sponges, absorbing the chemicals to which we are exposed, write the authors of Natural Detoxification. Water-soluble chemicals are absorbed and then excreted. However, fat-soluble chemicals accumulate in our fat cells and cell membranes. When the eye's body is under stress as during illness, emotional anguish, or nutritional deprivation, it releases these chemicals from the fat to circulate in the bloodstream. Later, these chemicals will return to the fat cells and cell membranes to be released another time. The release and return cycle of these chemicals continues indefinitely unless we help our bodies rid themselves of toxins. Over 4 million distinct chemical compounds have been reported in the e-literature since 1965, with 6,000 new compounds added to the list each week, write the authors of a study on chemicals found in the human body. More than 3,000 chemicals are deliberately added food, and over 700 have been identified in drinking water. Over 400 chemicals have been identified in human tissue, with some 48 found in adipose, fattal, 40 in breast milk, 73 in the liver, and over 250 in the blood plasma. Less than half of these toxins have been approved by our government agencies. The negative effects of toxic chemicals are amply discussed in other books. It is my hope that this brief overview encourages you to explore the topic more fully. Sauna therapy, which helps eliminate this toxic load, is discussed in Chapter 3. Electromagnetic toxicity. When knowledgeable people hear the word toxin, they commonly think of environmental pollutants and drugs and other dangerous chemicals. Sometimes they think of radioactivity as well. It's true that all of these substances overburden the body with wastes and often prevent it from functioning properly. But electromagnetic fields are another, very real, and usually hidden source of environmental pollution. Electromagnetic fields can have either beneficial or detrimental effects due to their ability to change the polarity and voltage of the cells. The benefits and dangers of different types of EM radiation, including the radiation emitted by Rife frequency devices, are discussed in detail in Chapter 4 and Appendix C. Injury. The relationship between injury and infection is complex but easy to recognize once you understand how injury can lead to illness. Inflammation is the body's way of dealing with irritation, regardless of whether the irritation caused by microbes, infection, chemicals, friction, heat, or toxin. During inflammation, various scavenger cells enter at the problem site to ingest dead and damaged tissue. The scavenger also act as a cushion or barrier between the local damaged tissue and the surrounding healthy areas. In addition, an increased supply of blood is generated by the immune response to bring extra nutrients, oxygen, and hormones to the repair site. Infection, on the other hand, is a pathological, diseased state of the tissues involving microbes. The microbes force their way into various cells in the body and, as a byproduct of their own metabolic and survival functions, introduce waste materials into the tissues that don't belong there. The speed at which microbes proliferate depends on the body's pH, the amount of oxygen in the system, and glucose levels, among other factors. The body reacts to this biological assault by feeling pain. The nerves are being chemically irritated. Malfunction, microbial toxins unfavorably alter the body's pH, poison the system, and hamper waste removal, and/or swelling. This is the point at which infection and inflammation overlap. The body responds to localized microbial infection through swelling to contain the infection and protect the surrounding tissues from being inundated by pathogens. But inflammation itself can cause infection. For example, during a non-microbial swelling such as an injury, if the scavenger cells cannot break down and digest the damaged tissue quickly enough, the injured cells in the area will putrefy. Then, an infection due to microbial contamination and or endogenous toxins will result. Unfortunately, on those occasions when the body's inflammatory response lingers past the point of usefulness, the swelling continues for too long, slowing down the circulation in the area and thus preventing healing. At this point, to eliminate the swelling, one might try the opposite effects of heat and cold through the alternating application of ice packs and sauna or cold and hot water. Any debris, no matter what its cause, that remains in the system without being cleared can cause inflammation and eventually infection. Injury can have long-lasting, sometimes permanent negative effects on the body. What begins as a mechanical stress can quickly become biochemical in nature due to the secretion of stress hormones and the accumulation of white blood cells in the area. This is why sudden physical shock to the system, which causes tissue damage, can aggravate already existing problems and bring microbes to the area where previously there were few or none. pH imbalance. Another important contributor to becoming ill is disturbance in the body's pH, or acid-alkaline balance. Although disturbed pH results from nutrient deficiencies, the converse is also true. When the acid-alkaline balance is awry, it can either augment a problem that already exists or create new problems. Sometimes a seriously ill person can become well just by correcting his or her acid-alkaline balance. However, this procedure is not as simple as it might seem because different areas of the body, at optimal function, have different levels of acidity and alkalinity. I'll get to this in a moment. pH expresses the degree of acidity or alkalinity of fluid, measured on a scale of 0 to 14. The designation is derived from P, a mathematical symbol used to make the calculation, and H, the chemical symbol for hydrogen. The element hydrogen, in particular hydrogen ions, are key to measuring pH. An ion is a charged particle that has gained or lost one or more electrons. When ions are present in liquid, electrical energy can be conducted through the solution. In a solution, different elements form ions in varying amounts, depending on the ability of the atoms to gain or lose electrons. These atoms dissociate, ionize, in solution to form hydrogen ions, H+, or hydroxyl ions, OH. Even though pH selectively measures only hydrogen ion activity, it refers to both acidity and alkalinity, since the lessening or absence of H+ implies an increase or the sole presence of OH. This bit of chemistry may seem rather dry, but it's relevant to health. pH relates to ion concentrations. It is minerals dissolved in solution that determine the presence of hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions. Also, minerals in solution conduct an electrical charge. When the systemic fluids act like batteries, that is, conduct electrical charge, nutrients can enter the cell and wastes can leave. But if the electrical charge of the cells and bodily fluids is too weak, our bodies don't work properly and we become ill. Depending on the presence or absence of H+ and OH ions, the solution will be acidic, neutral, or alkaline. If the H+ concentration is greater than OH, the material is acidic. The pH values of acids range from 0.0 to 6.9, less than 7.0. If the OH concentration is greater than H+, the material is alkaline or basic. The pH values of bases range from 7.1 to 14.0, greater than 7.0. If equal amounts of H+ and OH ions are present, the material is neutral at exactly 7.0. Note that the numbers on the acidity-alkalinity scale do not represent equal divisions. Each number higher than the one before it represents an exponential increase. 1 is 10 times greater than 0, 2 is 10 times greater than or 100 times greater than 0, 3 is 10 times greater than 2 or 1,000 times greater than 0, and so on. This means that even a small change in the measurement of systemic acidity matters a great deal. Sometimes, people talk about being too acidic. This is too general a reference to provide much meaningful information about health, because different parts of the body are designed to have intrinsically differing ranges of acidity or alkalinity. The optimal pH levels for the blood, urine, saliva, and various bodily tissues are different from one another. For instance, the skin is normally acidic. Its natural surface acids help protect it. The saliva must be alkaline, since alkalinity helps to digest starches. Carbohydrate digestion begins in the mouth. On the other hand, the stomach fluids must remain at about 2.0, which is very strongly acidic. Only an adequate supply of hydrochloric acid can help the inactive form of pepsin in the stomach convert to its active form, and thus digest protein, animal or vegetable. Often, there is an inverse relationship between acidity in the stomach and acidity in the body. The more desirably acidic the stomach is, the more desirably alkaline the body tissues are, and the more undesirably alkaline the stomach is, the more undesirably acidic certain parts of the body are. Sufficient hydrochloric acid in the stomach for digestion means that fewer undigested food particles travel through the intestinal wall and lodge in cells as irritating, usually acidic wastes. The one body area whose pH must stay within a very narrow range of alkalinity is the arterial blood plasma. Depending on which authority is being cited, the ideal pH for THE blood plasma ranges from about 7.35 to 7.4. If the blood deviates too much from its ideal pH for too long period of time, the person becomes sick and dies. The watery blood plasma is a liquid, entirely different from the round red blood cells that float in it and whose iron content gives the blood its red color. The job of regulating the acid-alkaline ivals belongs to the respiratory tract, the chemical and physiological buffering system, which includes the liver, and the urinary tract. The respiratory tract alters the rate of carbon dioxide ventilation from the bodily fluids. This in turn changes the ion concentration through a series of biochemical processes. The chemical and physiological buffering system of the body undergoes number of different steps to produce special biochemicals that also counteract the acidic pH imbalance in the blood plasma. It is the urinary tract network, however, that is the body's most efficient method for getting rid of acids. The kidneys play a prominent role in excreting acid through the urine. But even this method has its limitations. The blood transports excess acid to the kidneys only a little bit at a time, and slowly. No matter how hard the kidneys are forced to work, assuming they don't become overloaded, there is only so much acidity they can excrete. After the kidneys have excreted all they can, if excess corrosive acids and acid-forming substances still threaten to damage the bloodstream, the acids are simply relocated elsewhere in the body to protect the blood. Waste accumulates in the system more often than many people realize, which is why cleansing and detoxification are so central to natural medicine. If the body does not eliminate waste quickly enough, the toxins get stored in cells. The extracellular fluids surrounding the connective tissue, the joints, and even the organs. This is how a chain reaction of deterioration in bodily functions starts to occur. It is this auto-intoxication, a condition of being poisoned by one's own toxic wastes, that lays the foundation for degenerative conditions including arthritis and bone loss, allergies, cardiovascular problems, diabetes, fibromyalgia, kidney stones, and even cancer. Despite recent publicity on the importance of having in areas of the body need to be acidic system, some alkaline even if other areas need to be alkaline. This is why testing either urine or saliva provides an incomplete biochemical. Some regions can be too alkaline and portrait. Also, excessively alkaline tissue in one area invariably has counterpart of excessively acidic tissue in another area. For example, blood with a pH of 7.45 instead of 7.4 is too alkaline. This means that the corresponding extracellular fluid's too acidic. Functionally, the red blood cells won't release enough oxygen to the tissues, which will become oxygen deprived. This delicate balance can be corrected by eating more leafy greens. Balancing pH is complex, so consult a holistic practitioner knowledgeable in body chemistry, metabolic processes, and the nutritional needs of specific metabolic types. Storing overly acid or alkaline wastes in the tissues to them out of the bloodstream, while necessary and get viable intervention by the body, is, at best, an emergency, short-term solution to pH imbalance. Bone loss is a good example of a highly unbalanced, overly acid system. It also graphically illustrates malabsorption or shortage of calcium and other minerals, which are key factors in maintaining the proper pH. Most of the calcium we ingest is not used for bone construction, but instead freely circulates in the body to be utilized in various metabolic processes, including the neutralization of systemic acid. The blood's pH balance is so crucial that when no more calcium is available, the body leaches it from the bones. This is why getting enough calcium is so important, particularly if you are ill. However, the rush to supplement the diet with calcium has brought its own set of problems. Some people take too much calcium without also taking enough magnesium, boron, and other nutrients that help the body utilize the calcium. Under these conditions, bone loss and other symptoms that we commonly associate with calcium deficiency occur because the excess unbalanced calcium is disintegrating the bones. Also, there are acid-forming and alkaline-forming varieties of calcium. Different people require different forms. Proliferating pathogens. Pathogenic microorganisms are probably the most obvious component of illness. Since bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi thrive in an unbalanced pH environment, the same factors that cause tissue deterioration also allow microorganisms to proliferate. As you may recall, Béchamp pointed out that the function of pathogenic microbes is to break down bodily tissue that is already diseased. But the scavenger function of bacteria has complex ramifications. If these modified microzymas were only getting rid of debris, we humans could eat whatever we wanted and subject ourselves to all kinds of abuse without worrying about the consequences. We could binge on junk, see the body react by becoming toxified, and then blissfully sit back while the transmuted microzymas cleaned up the mess. The problem is, once the microzymas have transmuted into bacteria, viruses, or fungi, feeding on unhealthy and fermented body tissue causes them to excrete unhealthy, mostly acidic, waste materials. It is these microbial waste materials, or mycotoxins, that further contribute to a rising spiral of sickness. Thus, the phrase, "you are what you eat," takes on new meaning. The myco in the word mycotoxin is from the Greek myx, which means fungus. As mentioned in Chapter 1, toxin is a poison. One common mycotoxin is acetaldehyde, which in turn breaks down into the poisons oxalic acid, uric acid, and alcohol. The more noxious the waste that is discharged into the body, the sicker we feel. The term mycotoxins also applies to the waste material of pathogenic corpses that shatter in the body, a waste commonly known as die-off. Ideally, a white blood immune cell will attack, immobilize, and devour pathogen whole, thereby transmuting it, before the microbe has a chance to shatter and spew its toxic waste into the bloodstream. However, this best-case scenario is not always possible. Many people who are ill, particularly with chronic conditions, do not have enough optimally functioning white blood cells to gulp down the invaders whole. Several factors can cause a pathogen to rupture rather than simply become immobilized. An assortment of drugs in the system, the natural dying process microorganisms, they leak out toxins from their walls to defend against counterattack by the host, and in some cases, rife technology. As sick people know, the resulting foul die-off feels terrible. However, it's still preferable to shatter a microbe than have it live and repopulate the IT body with baby microbes. Chapters 3 and 4 address how to deal with microbial waste. Toxic bodily responses. Illness can also occur as a result of noxious biochemicals, non-beneficial hormones, or other endogenous substances produced by the body itself in response to these mycotoxins. A cyst, for example, is a sac containing liquid that forms around foreign material in the body to contain it and prevent the rest of the system from being poisoned. Western doctors often perceive the cyst as the medical condition itself rather than an expression of a deeper disruption. Put another way, they call the cyst the cause of the problem rather than the effect. The body's attempts to protect itself, while not always convenient or efficient, do demonstrate an attempt to achieve equilibrium. The holistic approach recognizes that the body's tendency to form cysts is intricately related to an impaired waste removal function. Most people have not heard of the mycotoxin called acetaldehyde. However, many of us are familiar with acetaldehyde's breakdown products oxalic acid, uric acid, and alcohol, since they are found in foods. Oxalic acid is a common toxin in many foods, including tomatoes, which contain high amounts. If eaten continually by a susceptible person in large enough quantities, as in the concentrated form of tomato sauce, oxalic acid can produce inflammation in the joints. Another toxin, uric acid, cannot be destroyed by the body. If it is not excreted by the kidneys, it crystallizes as kidney stones. A high-protein diet is said to help form uric acid. However, complementing the protein with plenty of vegetables and enzyme-rich foods will help the system dissolve the uric acid crystals. As for alcohol, reframing this legal drug as a toxin gives us a different perspective. Alcoholic beverages are produced when a fruit or grain is allowed to ferment. During the fermentation process, the yeast feeds on the food sugars and excretes alcohol, which is considered a desirable occurrence. However, alcohol is actually a waste product yeast poop. It destroys brain cells, which people experience as intoxication, and its rapid metabolization by the body can cause liver damage. Emotional states and belief systems. The last and very important component to becoming ill is one's emotional state and belief systems. I'll discuss emotions first. Emotional states consist of joy, anger, love, rage, sadness, excitement, etc. Emotion is really energy motion, and this energy corresponds to both electrical and chemical messengers in the body. Electrical messengers are the charge that energizes the nervous system. Chemical messengers are the minute amounts of hormones that circulate throughout the body. For example, fear and depression occur simultaneously with the outpouring of the fight-or-flight corticosteroid adrenal hormones. A feeling can be divided into two parts, the emotional content and the urge to express the emotion through action or behavior. For example, love, the emotion, is a tangible energy. It expands the heart and chest in a pleasurable way and builds cavity up a charge. When the charge substantially accumulates, most people feel a need to discharge that energy. This is often done through hug or other affectionate touch, the act, which allows the built-up energy to flow out from the chest through the shoulders, arms, and hands. Sadness, the emotion, is accompanied by crying and sobbing, the act, to discharge the energy, and so on. Holding back from expressing an emotion general begins as a conscious behavior, and people are aware of their choice. But over time, if the emotional issue is not resolved, this holding back becomes unconscious or automatic, beneath one's level of awareness. At one time or another, most of us have probably held our breath when faced with dread, fear, or other uncomfortable emotions. More chronic, habituated responses to avoid feeling deeply include shallow breathing, which inhibits the natural biological response or act of vocalizing those emotions, and biting the lower lip and tensing the abdominal muscles and diaphragm to prevent sobbing. Once the reason for holding back is not addressed, the muscular contraction that was deliberate becomes automatic. So that initially person is no longer aware of the emotion being held in the tensed muscles. Awareness of emotions means the ability to choose to act on them or not act on them while having the option to release or transmute them. But being unaware of emotions extracts a price: the chronic tightening of muscles, including the diaphragm, organs, glands, and even skeletal tissue. This constriction prevents nutrients as well as oxygen from reaching the tissues, which contributes to the accumulation of waste products and an unbalanced pH. The suppression and mismanagement of emotions also contribute to illness, because tension, upset, and worry, which corresponds to the adrenal secretion of fight-or-flight biochemical messengers, create excess acidity in the system. In this unnaturally over-acid condition, pathogenic microbes proliferate. Emotions and beliefs are not the same, although they are related to each other. Belief systems are our thoughts about how the world operates, which we call reality. Belief systems are based on our emotional states, experiences, and what we have been cognitively taught. For example, someone with loving parents who helped her feel secure and wanted would be likely as an adult to view the world as a safe place, where one's needs are easily and joyful met. But someone whose parents wanted her to conform to their own standards, rather than accepting her for who she really was, might later view the world as a place of conflict and struggle. To the two people in the above example, the world is a radically different place. Just as we can approach health by changing our physical environment, which can positively affect our emotional state, we can change our belief systems and emotional states, and thus the condition of the body. People whose illnesses are caused or strongly influenced by emotional states might consider seeking some form of psychological healing. Sometimes love is precisely the one ingredient that is missing in our lives. The restoration of love and hence of connection to oneself and others may be the needed component of one's healing. Emotional factors are sometimes derided by doctors and laypersons who use the pejorative term psychosomatic illness. This implies that since the diseased state is all in one's mind, is somehow not real, not worth serious attention. But psychosomatic simply refers to the connection between mind and body. The emotional and mental components of illness are as important as the physical. Paying attention to these aspects could save your life. At the very least, maintaining a genuinely positive outlook will enhance the quality of your life. Chapter 6 describes in detail some revolutionary experiments on the relationship of mind, body, and emotions. After you read about these studies, you will understand why I did not include genetic inheritance as one of the contributors to becoming ill. Healing the terrain. Illness usually arises from many complex factors, rather than being the simple consequence of pathogenic microbes invading the system. However, it can be difficult to correct the bodily terrain on which the microbes feed. Those who are the most toxified and ill have the most urgent need to eliminate waste. But increased energy is required for waste removal, and a sick person usually doesn't have an erg to spare. Moreover, these transmuted microzymas are reproducing at a brisk rate, usually faster than the immune cells can eliminate them. Compounding the problem, very ill person generally harbors yeast, fungi, and molds. These organisms, which appear at the final stage of a microzyma's transmutation cycle, are often the most damaging. They are not only the most sophisticated in structure and function, but they exist in the most fermented, acid state possible for living tissues. The over-acidity in the system causes more fermentation, which then creates even more transmuted microzymas. The microzymas, in turn, excrete more acidic waste materials, which then ferment even more tissue, which then creates more acidity, and the whole vicious cycle begins all over again. All this not only contributes to, but can directly cause, degenerative disease. Unfortunately, people with an unbalanced pH usually have little or no interest in eating nutrient-rich vegetables or protein-laden meats. Instead, they prefer sweets, refined starches, and even alcohol, all of which further unbalance the pH. Ironically, the craving for unhealthful substances is largely due to the hunger pangs of the sugar-loving pathogens, which need this to survive. Not surprisingly, the biochemical message sent by the parasitic microbes, "Feed me junk," is often confused with the person's own hunger signals. No wonder people sometimes feel enslaved by their cravings and wonder if it's possible to get well. To be fair, some holistic practitioners debate whether the terrain is everything is true in every single case of illness. In less than half century, genetically engineered and unnaturally mutated germs have emerged that are so virulent they seem capable of altering the bodily environment in even reasonably healthy individuals. One example is the huge corkscrew-shaped Lyme spirochete, which can bore into bone. Due to its size and shape, it can cause intense physical pain and severe disabilities, including blindness. As thousands of Lyme sufferers know, usually the healthiest diet alone cannot halt the deterioration caused by Lyme. Recovery requires many different modalities, including Rife therapy to directly destroy the pathogen. Healing, therefore, has many approaches. The terrain may not be everything in every case, but re-establishing its integrity is critical. Now, I want to address arguments that appear to refute Béchamp's claim that diseases are caused by unbalanced internal conditions. History proves that a substantial decrease in hospital fatalities and an improvement in public health took place once physicians began washing their hands before performing surgery and dressing wounds. However, as Wallene James explains, when unclean or putrefying matter, conveyed by hands, dressings, or other means contacts fresh wounds, it introduces morbid microzymas that alter the normal function of the inherent microzymas of the body. This is not merely superfluous window dressing of Pasteur's germ theory. The differences, though subtle, are important. According to Pasteur, all disease originate from outside attackers, germs, that penetrate an otherwise pristine and healthy system, with no internal systemic response other than the mobilization of immune cells to ward off the invaders. However, as Béchamp recognized, the body is never a passive observer of its circumstances. There is always a synergistic relationship between internal and external conditions. Take the example of decreased illness after doctors began washing their hands in hospitals. When a doctor performs surgery on a patient with unwashed bloody hands that have previously touched someone else's open wound, that surgery patient becomes sick because it is foreign material rather than a pathogenic microbe per se that has been introduced into the patient's body. The phrase foreign material is key here. Human beings are not constructed to harbor life forms alien to their innate processes. James summarizes Béchamp's findings. There are functional differences in the microzymas of 1. The same organs and tissues of the same animal at different ages, 2. The blood and tissues of different species, and 3. The blood and tissues of different individuals of the same species. Because microzymas of different species are functionally different, each species has diseases peculiar to it. Certain diseases are not transmissible from one species to another and often not from one individual to another, even of the same species. Microzymas, then, are species and organ-specific, and even person and age-specific. The specificity of microzymas to a given location explains how the introduction of foreign blood proteins, to use the above example, can make someone sick. It is not the inoculated organisms which multiply, Béchamp wrote, but their presence and the liquid which saturates them causes a change in the surrounding medium, the person's body, which enables the normal microzymas to evolve in a diseased manner. Put another way, the introduction of agents foreign to the body upsets the chemical balance of the inner terrain. These foreign agents can be chemical toxins, junk foods, or waste products from unnatural microzymas. Once the environment of the body is thrown out of balance, the microzymas that regularly inhabit the system change in response to the altered chemistry. The foreign proteins do catalyze the change. However, the malady itself is caused by the body's own altered microzymas that have formed in response to the changed environment triggered by these outside agents. At this point, the pathogenic microbes that are multiplying are not foreign substances, but the body's own transmuted microzymas, which, because they are spewing their toxic reproducing and cycle waste into the system, perpetuate ill health as long as the inner terrain is unbalanced. See sidebar, vaccines as foreign substances. An infection catalyzed by external unsanitary conditions must be dealt with in the same manner as any other imbalance that involves the body's own transmuted microzymas. Attention must be paid to proper diet, purifying the blood, rest, and so on. We are not dealing with separate diseases here, only different manifestations of unbalanced conditions. An infection catalyzed by external unsanitary conditions must be dealt with in the same manner as any other imbalance that involves the body's own transmuted microzymas. Attention must be paid to proper diet, purifying the blood, rest, and so on. We are not dealing with separate diseases here, only different manifestations of unbalanced conditions. Significantly, Béchamp recognized the function of fever as the effort of the organism rid itself of the products of an abnormal fermentation to and dissimilation while inducing a return of the diseased microzymas to the original positive physiological condition. Pathogens cannot live beyond certain high temperatures, so the body finds a way to cook them by producing a fever. Béchamp's colleagues and the general public ridiculed his discoveries. James analyzes the barriers that prevented them from accepting what the scientist had proven in his laboratory. First, the germ theory, fit neatly into the mechanistic theories of the universe that were popular in the 19th century. Second, it fit human nature. Man, apparently, ever ready to avoid responsibility and place causation outside himself, found an easy scapegoat in the bad little organisms that flew about and attacked him. After all, it wasn't too long ago that evil spirits had been responsible for man's ills. Third, it fit commercial nature. When we place causation outside ourselves, we create vast armies of attackers and defenders, assailants and protectors. In the case of disease causation, our protectors are such things as vaccines, drugs, X-rays, and the like, and their administrators, medical practitioners. The possibilities for commercial exploitation are endless. Is it any wonder that the powers that be conservative, well-established scientific authorities were behind Pasteur? Unfortunately, mechanistic thinking, the abdication of personal responsibility, and commercial nature are still largely the dominant paradigm today. Vaccines as foreign substances. The consequence of introducing foreign substances into the body, things that never belonged there and should not be allowed there, now helps explain the harmful effects of vaccinations. Substances used in vaccines include a known as carbolic acid, a poisonous acid derived from coal tar, nonetheless marketed phenol, also by the pharmaceutical medical industry as an antiseptic, mercury or aluminum-based preservatives, highly poisonous in any form, and acetone, a highly unstable solvent commonly used in nail polish remover. The main ingredients of vaccines are foreign proteins such as chick embryo, monkey kidney cells, calf blood serum, and other materials that, because they are injected directly into the bloodstream, actually become part of our genetic makeup. The introduction of foreign proteins into the body via vaccines is an eerie precursor to genetically engineered crops, in which foreign proteins are forced into the genetic structure of plants through the mechanical splicing of DNA. Laypeople who object when pesticides or fish genes are spliced into their tomatoes know instinctively that it is wrong, even though they may lack the scientific background to explain why. Simply put, foreign proteins are not meant for the bodies of human beings, otherwise we would already possess them, and they wouldn't be foreign. When alien materials are introduced into a living organism, the body becomes foreign unto itself. This explains the high rate of autoimmune diseases in response to vaccines. It also explains why such a high percentage of organ transplants are rejected. The recipient body is only doing its job, instructing its immune cells to attack the transplanted organ, a foreign invader, at which point doctors pump the patient full of drugs to suppress this natural systemic response. Béchamp's scientific progeny. Had Béchamp been the only physician who observed these basic units of life that transform as the body changes, he might have passed into obscurity. But professionals from many different sectors of the scientific and medical communities subsequently agreed with his findings. What follows is only a small sample. Rudolf Virchow. By the age of 25, 19th-century Prussian Rudolf Virchow had become a doctor and the founder of pathology, who discovered and named many structures and tissues in the human body. Perceiving that the presence of microbes was the effect rather than the cause of disease, he used the famous analogy that mosquitoes gravitate to stagnant water to feed, rather than being the cause of the stagnation itself. Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale was a 19th-century British mathematician and nurse who turned the devalued art of nursing into a respected profession and championed public sanitation because she understood that protecting the terrain was the biggest deterrent against germs. In 1860, she remarked, "Diseases are not individuals arranged in classes like cats and dogs, but conditions growing out of one another. I was brought up to believe that smallpox began as a first specimen in the world, which went on propagating itself in a perpetual chain of descent. Since then, I have seen smallpox growing up in first specimens where it could not by any possibility have been caught. Wise and humane management of the patient is the best safeguard against infection. The greater part of nursing consists in preserving cleanliness. The specific disease doctrine is the grand refuge of weak, uncultured, unstable minds, such as now rule in the medical profession. There are no specific diseases, there are specific disease conditions." Gunther Enderlein. A little later, in Germany, scientist Gunther Enderlein, 1872 to 1968, wrote about the different phases of the life cycles of microorganisms. He described how they can climb up the evolutionary ladder very quickly from their basic size 0.01 micron form, which he called endobionts, and assume more complicated forms with increased ability to perform complex functions. In Bacterian Gyclogeny, the life cycle of bacteria, Enderlein pointed out that the highly varied forms the microbes assume is a different phenomenon from the adaptive changes that occur when a bacterium becomes resistant to an antibiotic over several generations. He called microbes pleomorphic, from the Greek meaning many forms. Echoing Béchamp, Enderlein emphasized that the numerous developmental stages of a microbe are not freaks of nature, but naturally occur under certain conditions as part of the microbial life cycle. Pleomorphism, Enderlein wrote in 1950, is easily affected by increasing the local pH value. See sidebar, antibiotics, and microbe behavior. Enderlein had access to better microscopes than did Béchamp. Besides presenting specific data about how numerous classes of microorganisms function, he was able to describe in some detail the different microbial shapes. He developed a comprehensive program of biological medications directed at the microbe's different life cycle stages to help the body eliminate the pathogenic forms and rebalance itself. Enderlein understood, however, that as long as the bodily terrain remains favorable to ill health, the microbes will continue to evolve into their more toxic forms. That is why he also emphasized a healthy diet and the elimination of acidic wastes from the person's system as the chief components of good health. Swiss biologist Bruno Häfele worked with Enderlein. He reported that when acid accumulates in the body's cells due to poor diet and other stress, the cells begin to ferment. This provides a tasty snack for the malevolently transmuted microzymas and a wonderful opportunity for them to further ferment bodily tissue. Häfele's name for the basic unit of microorganism was proteid, but the concept was the same. All over the world, scientists were amassing the same data. Microbes evolve into what look like completely different microbes if conditions in the body support the change. Wilhelm Reich. Around the time that Enderlein was working in Germany and later Europe and the United States, his contemporary natural scientist and psychiatrist Wilhelm Reich followed a similar course and geographic itinerary with his own examination of microorganisms. In the 1930s, through special high-magnification microscopes that used dark-field condenser technology and had viewing capacity of up to 4,500 times, Reich was able to examine the life processes of minuscule organisms. After extensive experiments, he discovered living, mutable microscopic entities that he called bions. My observations of these bions and the resulting hypotheses, Reich freely acknowledged, clashed severely with the germ theory. These bions appeared to be none other than Béchamp's microzymas and Häfele's proteids. Based on the fact that the blood of the cancer patients he studied produced pathogens much more readily than did the blood of healthy people, Reich concluded that one's propensity to develop cancer is based on the ability of blood and bodily tissue, the terrain, to resist putrefaction. Significantly, Dr. Reich cautioned his critics against trying to duplicate his experiments without using identical measuring tools, a common mistake made by many scientists who try to replicate the work of other scientists. It is not really possible, he wrote, to verify the findings unless the same optics are used, original emphasis. This is why Reich described in detail the manufacturers, models, and technology of the microscopes that he used in his lab to examine the living specimens. Echoing Béchamp and foreshadowing some modern microscopists, Reich believed that what we call the cancer virus is actually a mutation of some of the body's own minute biological structures. Edward Rosenau's knowledge of the pleomorphic life cycle of microorganisms was not limited to Europeans. In 1914 in the U.S., Dr. Edward C. Rosenau, who among his other accomplishments was an associate at the Mayo Clinic for over 60 years and published over 450 medical papers, wrote an article in the Journal of Infectious Diseases. He described taking a variety of bacterial strains from different diseased tissues and placing them in separate petri dishes that all contained the same nutrient medium. When after a short period of time he examined the different dishes, he found no difference between the microbes. They all had transmuted into the same form. He and his colleagues were able to see this phenomenon almost 20 years later through Royal Rife's microscope. This will be discussed shortly. When Rosenau later returned the altered microorganisms to their original diseased tissues, their offspring assumed the original form and function of the parent microorganisms. Rosenau's simple experiment has been successfully repeated by other scientists. A. Van Beveren writes, "Thus there is no streptococcus for the throat and pneumococcus for the lungs. They are the very same bacteria feeding on and being modified by the substance they are breaking down. This is pleomorphism, and while once ridiculed, it is now being reconsidered in light of improved microscopic techniques." Royal Raymond Rife, a Renaissance man. As we explore the history of the discovery of pleomorphism, a major repeating theme is the quality of the microscopes used by the researchers. Although the microscopes of Béchamp's time limited his ability to report in minute detail the appearance of the microzymas, he could certainly identify them by function and location. The scientists who followed him achieved much more detailed descriptions due to improved microscope technology. This brings us to Royal Raymond Rife. Rife was born in Nebraska in 1888. He was raised by an aunt and uncle, as his mother died shortly after his birth, and his father was apparently unable to take care of him. By 1912, Rife had moved to San Diego and married a Chinese-American woman named Mamie Ah Quinn Mamie. Mamie, the third of 12 children, had been born into a wealthy and highly respected family in the San Diego Chinese community. In fact, her father was regarded as the unofficial mayor of Chinatown. Among his many accomplishments, the elder Ah Quinn A was a labor broker, recruiting newly arrived Chinese immigrants to build the railroad. He also had considerable bilingual talent and extensive legal knowledge, which made him a favorite translator in the courts. More is known about the Ah Quinn men than the women. For instance, one of Mamie's brothers later became part owner of a tourmaline mine that supplied jewels to the Dowager Empress in China. But we do know that all of the Ah Quinn children were reported to have received musical instruction. And from what we know about the father's efforts to assimilate into American culture, he cut off his back braid, an offense punishable by death in China, and the entrepreneurship of the men in the family, it's reasonable to assume that Mamie's upbringing similarly focused on breeding, education, and adaptation to a new culture. All this, and Mamie's striking physical beauty, evidently attracted Rife to her. Because it was illegal for Caucasians to marry non-Caucasians at that time, Rife and Mamie probably got married across the border in Tijuana. The youngest daughter, Mabel, also married a Caucasian, and records show that she did so in Tijuana in the 1920s. The newlywed Rifes moved onto the estate of San Diego millionaire industrialist H. Timken, who hired Rife as his chauffeur and car mechanic. Timken quickly recognized that Rife was not a typical employee. A gifted musician and artist, Rife had already educated himself in the fields of optics, electronics, biology, and chemistry. Additional education for Rife included studies at Johns Hopkins University, 2 years of training to perform eye surgery, and 6 years of study with optical scientist Hans Luckel, who worked for German-based company Zeiss Optics and was in the New York plant when he taught Rife. Rife is also said to have received an honorary Doctor of Parasitology degree from Heidelberg University, but this cannot be verified. One Rifer who claims to have a copy of the degree has not allowed it to be publicly examined. Others who queried the university have been told that no such degree has been located. In his lifetime, Rife is known to have designed and built many medical research instruments, including spectroscopes, optical tools, micromanipulators, and stop-motion photomicrographs. With one of his own photomicrograph inventions, he is thought to have made all of the pictures that appeared in the Atlas of Parasites, published by the University of Heidelberg in Germany. According to several reports, the governments of the United States and several foreign countries later awarded Rife over a dozen medals for scientific work involving variable pitch propellers, machine gun synchronization gears, inclinometers, and high-altitude barometric pressure scales. Royal Rife reportedly had a period with the United States Navy during World War when he traveled to Europe to examine foreign laboratories for the U.S. government. Among other tributes, he was awarded a research fellowship in biochemistry by the Andean Anthropological Expedition Institute for Scientific Research, August 10, 1940. According to Rife researcher and engineer Dave Felt, Rife was also offered an honorary Doctor of Science degree by the University of Southern California in 1936, but never accepted it. One of Rife's inventions had been some sophisticated X-ray equipment that Timken was using to examine the entire assembly line in his tapered roller bearing factory. Around 1920, the X-ray array detected faulty hairline fractures in the steel that was used to manufacture the bearings. This saved Rife's grateful employer hundreds of thousands of dollars. Thereafter, Rife spent even more time in his laboratory, which was located above the Garage Amelia C. Bridges estate and had been financed by Bridges and other wealthy sponsors. It was in this lab that Rife created some remarkable optical equipment. The universal microscope Rife was used to working alone. However, he was catapulted into the public eye when he built the first of 5 microscopes that were far superior in resolution or performance to anything thus far available. Although Rife was a contemporary of both Enderlein and Reich, He appeared to be unaware of the microscope technology and research of his European counterparts. We do know that he was so dissatisfied with the existing level of microscopy, he was determined to create something better. The most powerful and celebrated instrument, completed in 1933, was the 200-pound 682-part universal microscope. Standing between 2 and 3 feet high, had a magnification power of about 60,000 times, with a resolution of 31,000. Reif's microscope had some unique design features. The new microscopes by Raymond E. Seidel and M. Elizabeth Winter, which described how the universal microscope worked, appeared in a 1944 journal of the Franklin Institute and was reprinted in the annual report of the Board of Directors of the Smithsonian Institution for the period ending June 30th, 1944. Reif later remarked that despite few errors, the article was basically correct. Some highly technical details from the article are included to illustrate the level of expertise and legitimacy conferred on Reif by the medical community. Dr. Royal Raymond Reif of San Diego, California, has built and worked with light microscopes which far surpass the theoretical limitations of the ordinary variety of instrument. The entire optical system of lenses and prisms, as well as the illuminating units, are made of block crystal quartz. The illuminating unit used for examining the filterable forms of disease organisms contains 14 lenses and prisms. When light comes into contact with a polarizing prism, it is divided or split into 2 beams, one of which is refracted to such an extent that it is reflected to the side of the prism without, of course, passing through the prism, while the second ray, bent considerably less, is thus enabled to pass through the prism to illuminate the specimen. When the quartz prisms on the universal microscope, which may be rotated with vernier control through 360 degrees, are rotated in opposite directions. They serve to bend the transmitted beams of light at variable angles of incidence while, at the same time, a spectrum is projected up into the axis of the microscope, or rather a small portion of a spectrum since only a part A of a band of color is visible at any one time. However, it is possible to proceed in this way from one end of the spectrum to the other, going all the way from the infrared to the ultraviolet. Now, when that portion of the spectrum is reached in which both the organism and the color band vibrate in exact accord, one A with the other, a definite characteristic spectrum is emitted by the organism. A monochromatic beam of light, corresponding exactly to the frequency of the organism, for Dr. Reif has found that each disease organism responds to and has a definite and distinct wavelength, a fact confirmed by British medical research workers, is then sent up through the specimen and the direct transmitted light, thus enabling the observer to view the organism stained in its true chemical color and revealing its own individual structure in a field which is brilliant with light. Reif's method of illuminating microbes was extraordinary. Microbes seem invisible to us because the human eye can see only a very narrow band of light, color, on the electromagnetic spectrum and not in the ultraviolet range that many microorganisms reflect. However, applying certain laws of optics, Reif translated the natural emanations of the microorganisms to the portion of the electromagnetic spectrum that humans can see. By rotating the microscope's quartz prisms in various configurations, Reif literally tuned into the frequencies of microbes, expressed as color on the visible portion, to us, light of the electromagnetic spectrum. Put another way, as Reif approached the precise frequency of the microbe began to resonate or vibrate in response to the narrow band of light that was being aimed at it. The microorganisms became illuminated when the light that was shown on it matched its own inherent energetic light presented wave signature. Typhoid itself as brilliant turquoise, the cancer virus as purplish red, and on. See sidebar, Viewing the Carcinoma Virus. Viewing the carcinoma virus. Although Reif was usually successful in viewing microorganisms, initially he had trouble detecting the carcinoma virus. One day, he serendipitously placed a tube of cancer culture inside an electrified glass ring filled with 24 argon gas and left it there for about 24 hours. When he later examined the culture through his microscope, he noticed that it had acquired a purplish-red color that now made it visible. Remarkably, the specimen was still living. Thus, Rife discovered a method of staining the cancer virus with certain frequencies on the electromagnetic spectrum without killing it. Even when magnifying specimens only 31,000 times, its lowest range, the universal microscope far surpassed the best light microscopes that used conventional lighting, such as the popular Zeiss darkfield, oil immersion scope, and the electron microscope. Even though an electron microscope can enlarge an image up to 1 million times, it works by bombarding the slide with electrons in a vacuum, conditions under which no living organism can remain viable. Also, the microorganism will shrivel unless the slide on which it's placed is carefully sealed. By killing a microorganism before observing it, vital information, such as how the microbe functions in its natural state and what might destroy it, is lost. Steve Ross of the World Research Foundation once pointed out during a radio interview that the practice of killing specimens before viewing them is like picking up dead dog in the street and trying to figure out what the personality is. You're not looking at the same organism. Under Rife's microscope, these live organisms, meticulously prepared on various types of slides, were different indeed. Rife's colleague Dr. Rosenow further verified, examination under the Rife microscope of specimens containing objects visible with the ordinary microscope leaves no doubt of the accurate visualization of objects or particulate matter by direct observation at the extremely high magnification obtained with this instrument. With such high resolution, not only did the universal microscope allow previously invisible microorganisms to be viewed, it also proved that they were pleomorphic. The new microscope's authors discussed the phenomenon of pleomorphism. The human body itself is chemical in nature, being comprised of many chemical elements which provide the media upon which the wealth of bacteria normally present in the human system feed. These bacteria are able to reproduce. They, too, are composed of chemicals. Therefore, JF, the media upon which they feed, in this instance the chemical or some portion of the chemicals of the human body, become changed from the normal. It stands to reason that these same bacteria, or at least certain umbers of them, will also undergo a change chemically, since they are upon media which are not now feeding normal to them, perhaps being supplied with too much or too little of what they need to maintain a normal existence. They change, passing usually through several stages of growth, emerging finally as some entirely new entity, as different morphologically as are the caterpillar and the butterfly. The majority of the viruses have been definitely revealed as living organisms, foreign organisms it is true, but which once were normal inhabitants of the human body. The authors named many organisms that became visible through Rife's microscope. Note that by the time the article was published 11 years after the debut of the universal microscope, the Rife ray had already been invented. This will be discussed shortly. The certain lethal frequencies mentioned below are those emitted by the Rife ray. Under the universal microscope, disease organisms such as those of tuberculosis, cancer, sarcoma, streptococcus, typhoid, staphylococcus, leprosy, hoof and mouth disease, and others may be observed to succumb when exposed to certain lethal frequencies, coordinated with the particular frequencies peculiar to upon them by rays covering a wide and directed each individual organism, range of waves. By means of a camera attachment and a motion picture camera not built into the instrument, many still micrographs, as well as hundreds of feet of motion picture film bear witness to the complete life cycles of numerous organisms. Rife himself understood the importance of pleomorphism. It is not the bacteria themselves that produce the disease, he emphasized, adding that he and his colleagues believe it is the chemical constituents of these microorganisms enacting upon the unbalanced cell metabolism of the human body that in actuality produce the disease. We also believe, he acknowledged, if the metabolism of the human body is perfectly balanced or poised, it is susceptible to no disease. Fortunately for Rife, there were a number of highly respected doctors and researchers in the medical and scientific communities who supported his work. Before Rife's third universal microscope was completed, he met bacteriologist Arthur I. Kendall. Kendall held many important positions during his lifetime, among them Dean of Northwestern Medical School, instructor at Harvard University Medical School, director of the Hygienic Laboratory, the forerunner of the present National Institute of Health, and chair of the Department of Bacteriology at Northwestern University in Illinois. Like Dr. Rosenau before him, Dr. Kendall had independently investigated the pleomorphic character of microbes. In a nutrient medium he developed, called the K medium after its inventor, he placed bacterial cultures that transmuted into another form. Once the delighted Kendall was able to view the transmuted bacteria through Rife's microscope and further confirm his findings, the two men began working together closely. Thereafter, Rife conducted many experiments with both Kendall and Rosenau, who both made public their position on issue of the California pleomorphism. In the December 1931 issue California and Western Medicine, the Journal of Medical Association, Rife and Kendall pubic report of some of their experiments on filterable forms of Bacillus typhus. Rife wrote in part, "We have classified the entire category of pathogenic bacteria into 10 individual organisms within its groups. Any group can be readily changed to any other organism within the 10 groups depending upon the media with which it is fed and grown. For example, with a pure culture of Bacillus coli, by altering the media as little as 2 parts per million by volume, we can change that microorganism in 36 hours to a Bacillus typhosus. Further controlled alterations of the media will end up with the virus of poliomyelitis or tuberculosis or cancer as desired, and then, if you please, alter the media again and change the A microorganism back to Bacillus coli." Rife also described the pleomorphic nature of the cancer virus. By continued microscopic study and stop-motion photographs, it was found that the BX virus had many changes and cycles as so with other microorganisms. The virus can be readily changed to other forms or cycles of themselves by the media upon which they are grown. By making all the K media slightly acid, we no longer have a BX, as we have classified this cancer virus, but we have what we term a B. In this stage or form, it is still a virus, but considerably enlarged from the initial BX, still retaining a purple-red refractive index, but will no longer pass the porosity of the W porcelain or diatomaceous earth filter. In this stage, the BY requires a much coarser N filter. The next stage finds this microorganism, now known as the monococcoid form, in the monocytes of the blood of over 90% of carcinomatous sick individuals. It was important that the medical community learn about the growing documentation of pleomorphism, as well as the technology available to observe it. So on November 20th, 1931, one distinguished doctor named Milbank Johnson gave a banquet in his Pasadena, California home to honor the accomplishments and achievements of two men, Dr. Kendall, for his K-medium for growing pathogens, and Royal Rife, for the microscope that enabled pathogens to be viewed. Among over 30 guests were some of the most prominent medical doctors, bacteriologists, and pathologists in the country. According to Steve Ross, in addition to such live meetings, over 100 newspaper articles were written about the universal microscope alone, 1930s and 1940s. Additional documents from that period show that many eminent researchers enthusiastically endorsed the instrument. In used more recent article on Rife, Jerry Vassilatos reports that Rife's microscopes were immediately obtained by Northwestern University Medical School, the Mayo Foundation, the British Laboratory of Tropical Medicine, and other equally prestigious research groups. Many specimens were obtained and studied. Active poliomyelitis cultures were studied, the virus successfully isolated, identified, and photographed in 1932 by Rife and Kendall. In these cultures, the team recognized Streptococcus motile blue forms resembling typhosis. These last reports were immediately transmitted to the Mayo Foundation and duplicated by Dr. E. Rosenau. Dr. Carl Meyer, director of the Hooper Foundation for Medical Research, University of California, came to the Rife Research Laboratories with Dr. Milbank Johnson, examining and corroborating the stated results. The impossible and anomalous became fact. Bacilli could act as virus carriers. Furthermore, poliomyelitis victims evidenced a startling degree of typhosis-like associated virus. The discovery that viruses can exist inside bacteria, in the form of bacteriophages, is critical and impacts on the treatment of disease and the success or failure of rifing. This will be discussed further in Chapter 4. Rife was not content simply to view and identify pathogenic organisms. He wanted to cure disease. If he could identify microbes by using frequency, he reasoned, he could use frequency to destroy them. Frequency is the number of cycles per second at which an object vibrates, commonly expressed in hertz. Everything has an inherent resonant frequency or oscillatory rate. A competent architect is aware of this principle when designing bridges. If bridge is built without its oscillatory rate factored into the construction, a hurricane or heavy wind could cause the bridge to steadily vibrate in harmonic resonance for a long enough period that parts of it, if not the entire structure, will shatter or collapse. See sidebar, the Galloping Gertie disaster. Compromising the structural integrity of a bridge by exposing it to its oscillatory rate is similar to partly or completely shattering a microbe by exposing it to its oscillatory rate. Rife's various microscopes, which allowed him to see live microorganisms reacting in their environment, were indispensable to his future accomplishments. The high magnification abilities of these microscopes would allow him to find frequencies to destroy ever tinier microorganisms. The Galloping Gertie disaster. An excellent example of a structurally defective bridge is quite famous because its collapse happened to be captured on motion picture film, clips of which can be seen on various internet sites. In 1940, the mile-long, 1.6-kilometer Tacoma Narrows Suspension Bridge in the northwestern United States, now better known as Galloping Gertie, collapsed when steady wind provided so much energy that the bridge began oscillating in simple harmonic motion. When the oscillations became intense enough, the entire bridge collapsed. It took 10 years before its replacement was completed. The Rife Ray Royal Rife experimented with number of ray machine designs before finding a unit that satisfied him. In 1921 12 years before the construction of the universal microscope, Rife had built his earliest Rife ray, the Hash 1. With that ray, Rife could kill B. coli, a common bacterium residing in the colon. The Rife ray Hash 2 was built in 1923. By 1934, the Rife ray Hash 3 was developed. It was comprised of several bulky pieces that filled a large table in Rife's laboratory, making it not only difficult to move, but also labor-intensive to calibrate and operate. To produce the frequencies, the Rife ray Hash 3 used receivers. At some point, Kennedy brand receivers may have been used. The Kennedy receivers were regenerative, which simply means that they had built-in components designed to amplify the electronic signal so it would be stronger. However, as the Kennedy receivers were not shielded, more about this in a moment, other types were probably preferred in the final designs. Frequencies were emitted from the glass ray tube, which was mounted on a base on the outside of the cabinet and connected to the receiver. The ray tube used for the Rife ray was similar to X-ray machine tubes of the era, but it did not produce X-rays because X-rays are created in a vacuum, and this ray tube contained an inert gas. Rife initially experimented with mixtures of different noble gases, including argon and krypton, but he eventually chose helium because it withstood many more hours of bombardment than the other gases he tried. The gas-filled tube became brightly lit when a frequency of sufficient power was passed through it. Presumed to have been more powerful than its predecessors, the Rife ray Hash 3 outputted about 50 watts to the tube. 50 watts was enough power so that the frequencies emitted by the tube could penetrate through 15 inches of concrete. Even when the unit was one floor away from where the microscope stood, Rife demonstrated that after about 10 minutes, every specimen under his microscope died after the machine was turned on briefly. The microbes were devitalized not by the visible light emitted by the tube, but rather by the electromagnetic field, which includes electric and magnetic waves. Other bandwidth energies contributing to this effect may have included infrared and scalar waves, discussed in more detail shortly. Modern researchers sometimes refer to these combined fields as the Rife effect. Some components of the radio equipment included vacuum tubes. Housed inside the cabinet, the vacuum tubes were entirely different from the ray tube that was mounted on the outside of the cabinet. Vacuum tubes were somewhat fragile and bulky. They used a lot of energy, and they overheated easily. This is why engineers developed the transistor in the late 1940s. Unlike a hollow tube, the transistor was solid, hence the phrase solid-state technology. Transistors possessed all the beneficial electrical properties of vacuum tubes without any of their shortcomings. They were sturdy, inexpensive, tiny. They used very little power and could immediately turn on without requiring any warm-up time. Today, virtually all electronic apparatuses, including electromedical devices, use solid-state technology instead of vacuum tubes. As with all electronic equipment, Rife's frequency devices were potentially vulnerable to being affected by unwanted stray electromagnetic interference. The interference could come from motors, generators, cables carrying high levels of alternating or direct current, transformers, and even the Earth's own magnetic field. Electricity running through wires creates a magnetic field. See Appendix C for more information. For a unit such as the Rife ray, which required precision calibration and relied on exact frequencies to disable pathogens, even a little bit of interference could make a huge difference in whether or not the device was effective. Therefore, it was curious that with at least one of the Rife ray models, the components were not adequately protected from stray magnetic fields. We know this to be a fact because when a working Rife ray prototype was found around the year 2001, the late Rife researcher Aubrey Schoon, an engineer who spent considerable time with the device, wrote, "Because the plasma tube is an active circuit element, capacitive coupling from anybody in the vicinity of the plasma tube actually causes changes in the oscillator frequency. In other words, the very presence of someone near the tube, combined with tuning problems inherent in the device, caused the frequencies from the tube to waver. This unwelcome variation in frequency would not have occurred had the equipment been shielded, a problem that was widely recognized even during Rife's time as common to just about any electronic device. Shielding is the use of various materials to surround and protect components so they can operate properly without interference. Any material used to shield sensitive components is a good conductor. The material diverts the interference field so the field travels around the device instead of through it. The shielding can be used either to keep out the field or confine the field so it does not disturb other equipment that's in the same room, next door, or even miles away. Shielding materials include wire mesh, metal enclosures, conductive paint, foil tape, adhesive compounds, and mu metal. Mu, an alloy of nickel, iron, copper, and molybdenum, is highly effective at protecting against static fields and low-frequency magnetic fields. Mu metal was available in Rife's time, but it was, and still is, quite expensive. Today, to avoid interference, it's customary to shield sensitive equipment, everything from high-definition cathode ray tubes to amplifier circuits to wiring. Sometimes, to provide extra separation, the components are housed in discrete sections of the unit. I discuss shielding in some detail because it's relevant today. Most of the shielding problems in modern machines involve interference with external electronics. Any good frequency device costing thousands of dollars should be shielded. An unshielded unit running in the same room as a working computer or television will create a wavy picture, static, or both. Sometimes, sharing the same wall sockets or circuits will cause interference, but using different circuits, on different fuses or circuit breakers, will correct the problem. Interference can also manifest as an annoying hum, which occurs when the unit's power signal leaks into an amplifier circuit and the signal becomes augmented. Many people report hearing a hum in either their television set or their phone line when they are rifing. Moving the frequency instrument away from the other electronics usually eliminates the hum. The frequency capability of Rife's equipment spanned from what engineers call the audio range on the electromagnetic spectrum, measured in hertz, abbreviated Hs, to the ultrasonic and broadcast ranges, measured in megahertz, abbreviated MHz. The term audio range can be confusing to non-engineers. It simply refers to a frequency that could be heard if the electromagnetic waves were converted into sound waves. Megahertz frequencies, much higher than the audio range signals, if convertible to sound waves, would be beyond the range of human hearing. So they are not considered to be in the so-called audio range. In many of his units, Rife used a radio frequency, RF carrier wave, which was always in the MHz range. The RF signal served a dual purpose. The high-frequency signal was necessary to light the tube, but it also served as a foundation upon which other frequencies could piggyback onto it, like a ship on the ocean, the RF signal, carrying passengers, other frequencies. Also, the use of carrier waves produced heterodyning, the combining and merging of two original frequencies, which in turn created more new frequencies. The new frequencies resulted from the sum of the original two and from the difference between the original two. With Rife's units, it was sometimes impossible to determine which frequency was doing what, as all the signals sent to the ray tube were important. It was probably the unique combination of frequencies, wave shape, and energy fields that did the healing. The shape of the RF signal that was sent through the ray tube was a sine wave, which, by definition, is symmetrical, having a smooth, rounded shape. Square waves, commonly used in modern devices, could not be produced by the older equipment. The ray tube distorted the waveform, which produced many harmonics, higher frequencies created by main frequency under certain conditions. Some of these additional, higher frequency harmonics were even higher than what the receiver was capable of outputting. This helped make Rife's technology even more successful. The ray tube was a partially directional transmitter. Since its power or energy was concentrated into a small area, the practitioner placed the tube either within a few inches of the subject's body or, in some cases, directly on the person. Dr. Robert P. Stafford, one of Rife's colleagues, reported that when he treated people who had cancer, he focused on 6 square inches at a time, moving the tube up and down and back and forth on the body until the entire affected area was treated. The Rife ray's ability to eliminate disease was based on Rife's finding each organism's MOR, or mortal oscillatory rate, and dialing those rates into the machine. The May 6, 1938 edition of the San Diego Evening Tribune carried a now famous article by Newell Jones explaining how the microbes died through a process called entrainment. Each organism requires a different wavelength. What is occurring is something similar to when one musical tuning fork is set in vibration by sound waves emanating from another fork struck nearby. Another example is the vibration which almost everyone has noticed a pipe organ note causes in windows or furniture of the room where the instrument is being played. Again, a similar thing happens when a radio cabinet rattles from sounds passing from its speakers. It is commonly known that the sound from the first object causes the second to vibrate in harmony. The thing where the original sound-producing vibration occurs has the same pitch, wavelength, and frequency as the one giving the sympathetic response. One object may have a frequency which only is a part of a complex frequency possessed by the other. That is, one may be a simpler tone which is one element in a complex tone characterizing the other. The destruction of a microbe has often been compared to the cliché of a soprano singing a pure, focused tone that shatters a glass whose resonant frequency matches that particular note. While this explanation is easy for a lay audience to grasp, the analogy of sound to describe how Rife's equipment worked is not technically correct. In most circles, vibration, i.e., sound waves, is regarded as mechanical motion. However, since Rife's units could affect microorganisms through many inches of concrete, and concrete can absorb mechanical motion and prevent transferal elsewhere, it's clear that another force was responsible for the Rife ray's capabilities. We already know that the electromagnetic field emitted by Rife's machine could change the voltage of microbial cell walls. Even a minor alteration of voltage can unfavorably affect an organism's structural integrity and destabilize it. Today we understand one more possible influence on Rife's technology, the presence of scalar waves. Scalar waves are emissions that are not part of the electromagnetic, EM, spectrum. A few innovative researchers have evidence that some plasma devices emit scalar waves, as apparently did Royal Rife's instrument, and that these scalar waves help regenerate the body as well as possibly devitalize pathogens. See sidebar, scalar wave properties. When Rife finally did find the MOR, explains chiropractor James Baer, inventor of the Baer-Rife frequency device, the microorganism would lose its color and become clear as it absorbed the resonant energy of the frequency and changed or died. Sometimes the microbes shattered. Other times they simply weakened and lost their motility, the ability to move spontaneously and actively. Jones explained that some microbes writhe as if in agony and finally gather together in deathly moving clusters. Some types, Rife himself stated, will explode or disintegrate, and some will gather together like log jams agglutinate. All of Rife's frequencies were microbe-specific. The power of the unit was not as important as having the correct frequency. The inventor himself stated, 1/10 of a 1 meter or a smaller denomination off, and you have nothing. The frequency must be absolutely correct for that individual organism. When Rife mentioned meters, he was referring to the length of the wave that corresponded to the actual number in H's. How did Royal Rife determine the MOR of a microbe? First, he examined thousands of microbe samples and tissue cultures from laboratory animals and humans under the universal microscope. As usual, the microorganism was illuminated in its own colored light, while the surrounding field remained white. Then Rife tested the samples to ensure that a specific disease correlated to a specific microbe. He used Koch's cause of disease hypothesis, an allopathic medical model. Finally, Rife would turn the dials of the Rife ray ever so slightly, switch on the power, and then examine the slide under the microscope to see if this time he had found the correct frequency. The entire process was tedious and repetitious, involving painstaking observation. It was also a solitary task. Royal Rife was used to working this way, however. He had labored similarly to make the microbes visible under his microscope. His colleagues describe him as man of immense patience. In The Cancer Cure That Worked, Barry Lynes quotes Benjamin Cullen, who watched the scientist regularly. I've seen Roy sit in that doggone seat without moving, watching the changes in the frequency, watching when the time would come when the virus in the slide would be destroyed. 24 hours was nothing for him. 48 hours. He had done it many times. Sit there without moving. He wouldn't touch anything except a little water. His nerves were just like cold steel. He never moved. His hands never quivered. Of course, he would train beforehand and go through a very careful workout afterward to build himself up again. But that is what I would call one of the most magnificent sights of human control and endurance I'd ever seen. Rife's technology did not harm the human or animal host. The oscillatory rates of humans and small mammals are much more complex than, and much different from, the MORs of microscopic viruses, bacteria, or fungi. Rife was confident about the safety of his equipment and stated this on numerous occasions. With the 50 to 60 watts of power that is in these ray tubes, there is absolutely no harm. I had my ray tube right here about 11 or 12 inches away from the slide in the microscope. And here I was with that tube going year after year and it never harmed me any. And Yi stood in front of that thing, this RF ray tube, for years, finding these different frequencies that devitalize these different bacteria. And that thing was shooting on me right here, his chest, but is absolutely harmless to normal tissue. The non-invasive nature of this new method began generating great excitement in the medical community. Case studies. By the end of 1932, Rife was destroying the typhus bacteria and the cancer and other viruses that were both grown in cultures and inoculated into lab animals. Then, as well as now, standard scientific protocol for testing drugs and other treatments involved using two groups of infected animals, the group that received treatment and the control group that did not. If significantly more animals in the treated group lived than did those in the control group, this presumably indicated that the treatment was effective. To prove the effectiveness of the Rife ray, Rife was obliged to follow this standard procedure. He injected his rats with the disease organisms. Then he withheld treatment from the control group, all of whom died, and gave treatments to the other rats, all of whom lived. Within the confines of scientific protocol, Rife was kind to the animals. To spare them pain, which also made them easier to handle, he administered anesthesia before giving them injections or doing surgery. Rife describes the scientific protocol in detail. On one series of cancer tests, I inoculated the virus which I had isolated and filtered from an inculcated breast mass into an albino rat. The tumor was allowed to grow, and then I surgically removed the tumor and again isolated and filtered the virus from a portion of the ground-up tumor and inoculated the next rat, and repeated this procedure 411 times to prove that this virus was the causative agent of cancer. Eventually, Rife had to prove that microbes could be destroyed in humans without harming the host. To secure human subjects for his case studies, he was assisted by Dr. Milbank Johnson. Johnson, the medical doctor who had hosted the historic dinner honoring Kendall and Rife, was enormously wealthy, reportedly having assets worth around $15 million. After receiving a doctorate from Northwestern Medical School in 1893, Johnson was awarded a Doctor of Law degree in 1916 from the University of Southern California and another degree in 1920 from Northwestern University. The medically related posts he held during his illustrious career included Professor of Physiology and Clinical Medicine at the University of Southern California, Chairman of the Claims Committee of the Pacific Mutual Life Insurance Company in 1920, and Claims Director most of the years from 1906 until 1936, his retirement. Member of the Board of Directors at California's Pasadena General Hospital, Chief Surgeon of the Southern California Edison Company, and member of the Los Angeles Board of Health. Johnson's humanitarian nature and his interest in eliminating illness are amply demonstrated in his surviving letters. The fact that his first wife died in 1920 of cancer, plus a streptococcus infection following radiation treatments, undoubtedly made him even more interested in Rife's clinics. It was Dr. Johnson who convinced Timken to help finance Rife's new laboratory, which was built around 1935. Generally, Johnson remained loyal and supportive to Rife for as long as the two men were in contact. Pivotal to all phases of Rife's career, Johnson advised and guided Rife. He generated publicity, and he helped Rife with projects. Johnson himself initiated most, if not all, of Rife's research studies because Rife disliked the spotlight and preferred to focus on his laboratory work. Johnson assembled some of the most prominent professionals with outstanding credentials. Most of them had MD, PhD, or DDS degrees from Canada, England, and the United States to work with Rife. These professionals did independent studies, performed laboratory research, and worked directly with patients using the Rife ray. To test Rife's equipment on people with cancer and other illnesses, 3 clinics were set up, all of them funded by Johnson. The first clinic was set up in 1934 under the auspices of a University of Southern California Special Medical Research Committee in the La Jolla home of Ellen Scripps. Rife referred to this committee later on a legal document, and this particular clinic is often cited as a quintessential success by proponents of the technology. However, Dave Felt, based on a surviving letter by Dr. Johnson, believes that this committee was unofficial and the university's name was used in order to have some liability coverage for Scripps because they were using her property. Johnson probably asked Dr. Rufus B. von Kleinsmid, president of USC, if he could form the clinic under the umbrella of the university, and von Kleinsmid said yes. Most of Milbank Johnson's letters have been recovered. However, those dated between June 1934 and early 1935 are missing, so we can only guess at what actually occurred. From Dr. Johnson's surviving letters, we learn that Johnson had no help and no assistance, and that Rife's involvement in the 1934 clinic was minimal. In fact, Johnson had to plead with Rife, many ways the quintessential scientist who secludes himself in his laboratory to get involved with the clinic at all. We know that almost a dozen people were treated, perhaps as many as 16, most for cancer and a few for tuberculosis. Of the people in the 1934 study who were treated for cancer, some apparently did go into remission because tissue and fluid samples sent to pathologist Alvin Ford at the Pasadena General Hospital were stated to be free of any traces of cancer. However, Johnson did report later that in early 1935, one man returned to him. The cancer in his cheek had not improved, so Johnson sent him to a hospital to have the corresponding eye and the malignant tissue behind the eye surgically removed. In December 1935, letter from Johnson to Dr. Mildred Schramm of the International Cancer Research Foundation in Philadelphia, Johnson was apparently trying to solicit her assistance, he wrote, "I am also going to give you a brief of the cases which I treated in La Jolla, thels summer before last with their present status insofar as I can find the patients. There was nothing done at that time of a conclusive nature." If results of the first clinical trial were not conclusive, subsequent trials appeared. Promising. The second clinic established by Johnson was at the Santa Fe Hospital in Los Angeles. It opened the first week of November 1935. As with the first clinic, it was Dr. Johnson who ran the Rife-Ray machine. The third clinic opened September 1936 at the Pasadena Home for the Aged, another Scripps facility. This study, which focused on cataract reduction and elimination, showed impressive results. Dr. Johnson reported complete restoration of vision in 30 of 31 people he treated. The Pasadena clinic remained open until May 1937. Unfortunately for us, the frequencies used to eliminate the cataracts are not mentioned in Johnson's report. The equipment used in the 1936 clinic was the Rife-Ray H4, which engineer Philip Hoyland had built for Rife and Johnson in 1935. Johnson, eager to get the Ray machine into clinics, enticed Hoyland to leave his job as a radio repairman in Pasadena, come to work for Rife. Hoyland was employed to build a compact portable unit that could perform as well as Rife's best prototype. It was highly successful. As contemporary Rife researcher Sean Montgomery describes it, the thing was a bona fide cure-all, provided you tuned it to the correct prescribed pathogenic frequency using a precise methodology. This was 1935 to 1936. Around this time, Rife also set up a new laboratory in Point Loma with the help of Milbank Johnson. Some of the people who worked with Rife in the lab, administered therapy in clinical trials, or treated their own clientele using Rife's Ray were among the most respected professionals in the country. I mention the following people by name, along with some of their affiliations, to give a sense of the proficiency, talent, enthusiasm, and interest that surrounded Rife and his work. Agnes Baring, who worked with Rife in his laboratory from 1915 to 1946, to Berger, medical doctor, M.D., E.F.E. Kopp, M.D., James B. Cush, M.D., pharmacist, physician, and surgeon, Ben Cullen, George Dock, M.D., professor of medicine, later president of the Los Encinas Tulane University and Sanitarium of Pasadena, California, C. Fisher, M.D., of the Children's Hospital in New York, Alvin G. Ford, M.D., pathologist at Pasadena General Hospital and one-time president of the American Society of Pathologists, Oscar C. Gruner, M.D., pathologist, Archibald Cancer Research Committee, McGill University in Canada, Richard T. Hamer, M.D., Joseph Heitger, M.D., an eye doctor and good friend of Johnson, Arthur First Kendall, Ph.D., inventor of the K-medium and observer of pleomorphism in microbes, his daughter Alice Kendall, who assisted Rife in the lab, Royal Lee, Ph.D., an inventor of spectrographic and other equipment, and the developer of whole food supplements that are still produced today by the company he founded, Ray Lounsbury, M.D., Carl Meyer, M.D., pathologist and director of the Hooper Foundation for Medical Research of the University of California in San Francisco, Waylon Morrison, M.D., chief surgeon for the Santa Fe Railway, Edward C. Rosenow, M.D., SCD, and LLD, who had observed pleomorphism in microbes and was on the Mayo Clinic staff, Henry Seiner, trained in microscopy by Rife and sent to England to demonstrate a virus microscope, Vern Thompson, electronics expert, Ernest Linwood Walker, BAS, SCD, and Arthur W. Yale, M.D., director of the Yale Foundation in San Diego. In addition, W.D. Coolidge and Charles P. Steinmetz from General Electric furnished Rife with hundreds of tubes, which were manufactured to Rife's specifications. Meanwhile, across America and in Europe, other doctors were administering Rife's therapy privately to their own patients. Numerous pathogenic microorganisms were being deactivated or killed, among them Bacillus anthracis, Escherichia coli, or E. coli, called Bacillus coli or B. coli in those days, Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, and Treponema pallidum. People recovered from sarcoma, carcinoma, leprosy, tuberculosis, typhoid, tetanus, gonorrhea, pneumonia, and other ailments. Rife wrote, "I saw cancer and tuberculosis cases that had completely recovered. I saw Dr. Cush's brother who had come over from England. He had a 30-year sinus condition with terrible drainage. Dr. Cush used the frequency instrument on him and he was well in 3 weeks. Dr. Cush had treated Dr. Hamer, Maryland, for a sinus condition which cleared up. Dr. Cush had treated Dr. Butterfield, Maryland's brother-in-law, who had a stiff wrist, a tuberculosis of the bone which cleared up. Also, I saw a Mexican boy who had osteomyelitis of the bone, which Dr. Cush cleared up with the frequency the instrument. Saw George Lem being treated by Dr. Cush for tuberculosis, and he had come out from Chicago to die. He was sent from the Vulclane home. As soon as they found out that Couch was of getting results, they tried to get all of their patients back, but Lem said no, that was going to finish up with Cush, and he completely recovered." Rife noted that 2 frequencies instead of 1 were needed to eliminate all the symptoms of tuberculosis because, he discovered, more than one pleomorphic form of the microbe was involved in the disease. For cancer, Rife and his associates learned that treatment should be given for 3 minutes once every 3 days to give the lymphatic system enough time to remove the toxins. Modern frequency devices are different from Rife's original units, so treatment times are longer. For cancer protocols using contemporary equipment, see chapters 4 and 5. According to Gary Wade, it was possible for the Rife ray to have destroyed an entire cancer tumor in a single treatment consisting of 1 to 1.5 hours. But the resulting amount of dead tissue would have become a feast for a massive bacterial infection that could lead to liver and kidney damage and general toxemia. In the 3-minute treatments that were administered over longer period of time, the Rife ray killed a thin outer layer of cancer tumor tissue at one time, thus allowing the body's immune system to remove this layer before the next treatment. The administering doctors emphasized the need to drink 2 quarts or more of water a day. Otherwise, the liver, kidneys, and other organs would become overloaded from trying to eliminate too fast, too many dead microbes and their waste products. But they were not concerned about the waste. They understood it to be a normal outcome of detoxification. Since the Rife ray didn't do anything except what it was designed for, the destruction of pathogens, it could not be said to cause side effects, as the phrase is commonly meant. The cleansing reaction was a natural, reasonable, and in fact hoped-for process that occurs in a body that is ridding itself of microbial corpses and their waste products. The years 1936 through 1939 were tumultuous. The Beamrays Corporation was formed to manufacture more units, with both Rife and engineer Philip Hoyland listed as co-owners of the company. Incredibly, Hoyland was given 55% ownership, leaving Rife with only 45%, a grievous error that Rife would later regret. In May of 1938, a Hoyland-built compact unit, which, like the other machines, used an RF carrier wave, was featured in lengthy articles appearing in the San Diego Evening Tribune. It is believed that Dr. Hamer was the first doctor to use this Beamrays device in his clinic in the spring of 1938, followed by Dr. Cush, who had also used the H4 machine in the years preceding the Beamray model. Enthusiastic professionals sent the inventor letters, occasionally notarized, phrasing the Rife ray. Those lucky enough to have their health completely restored sent Rife sworn documents, some of which are posted at www.rife.org. Rife, his investors, co-workers, and colleagues hoped that this unit would help Rife and his technology achieve the recognition they deserved. Unfortunately, the promising period that Rife was enjoying was about to end. Beam Rays manufactured only 14 units, and the Rife was attacked from numerous quarters. The persecution of Rife. It was in 1939 that a series of catastrophes befell Rife, and which adversely affected the many people who depended on his unit to heal them. In Chicago, Morris Fishbein was expanding his personal and professional power as head of the American Medical Association and its chief public relations officer, despite the fact that, according to biographer Morris A. Beale, he had spent only 5 months as an intern at Durand Hospital. Note, Beale advised, that all other medical graduates are required to serve 2-year internships in some accredited hospital. But Fishbein's accession to editorship of the AMA Journal was a travesty on modern medicine, since he had never practiced medicine a day in his life. Fishbein was notorious for writing unfavorable reviews of products whose manufacturers did not advertise in the AMA Journal. However, if advertisers paid his rates, even ineffective and unsafe products could appear in the journal and receive its bogus seal of approval. Some of the products that Fishbein slandered are harmful, Beale acknowledged, but the Führer makes no distinction between worthy articles and quack remedies. Among the items Fishbein condemned were ironized yeast, a nutrient similar to brewer's yeast, Alka-Seltzer, an innocuous and effective over-the-counter antacid containing mostly bicarbonate of soda, and Sal Hepatica, a safe and effective homeopathic remedy. Anything and everything was subject to Fishbein's public smears. He called chiropractic malignant tumor and osteopathy and homeopathy cults. One of Fishbein's vilification of most fraudulent deceptions was an electromedical diagnosis unit called the Ellis microdynamometer. He deliberately published a faked picture of it in the AMA Journal and then submitted falsified description of the machine to the April 2, 1995 Congressional Record. Fishbein also set up dummy corporations through which advertising revenues was funneled back to him. As a result, he became eventually quite wealthy. So did the AMA. Many of Fishbein's investments were a matter of public record. The Illinois Medical Journal, which, as the publication of the Illinois Medical Society, had always been critical of unethical acts by the AMA, had proclaimed in an editorial back in December of 1922, "The AMA today is a one-man organization. The entire medical profession of the United States, insofar as its organization is concerned, is at the mercy of one man and board of trustees that is subservient to him." Unfortunately, the few voices raised to protest Fishbein's tactics and nearly unlimited power were unable to stop him. Fishbein was finally removed from his position in AMA convention in 1949, but not before he inflicted a lot more damage. There is evidence that the AMA, or the AMA as represented by Fishbein, played a key role in Rife's decline by organizing agents to steal the inventor's work, undermine the Beam Rays Corporation, and halt production of the units. In his article, Deconstructing Beam Rays Incorporated, Sean Montgomery describes this methodical scheme in intricate detail. Not surprisingly, he begins with a biography of Morris Fishbein, the founder of America's corrupt medical status quo, who was infamous for using his sway as the powerful AMA chief to buy into or buy out any legitimate medical device, drug, or process that crossed his path. Buy into for profit, or if it competes with already profitable enterprises, buy out to suppress. This was Fishbein's modus operandi. It is difficult to find any information on Morris Fishbein that does not condemn him. Montgomery acknowledges that he was unable to find references that Fishbein ever met Rife, let alone acknowledged, quoted, or even condemned him. However, Montgomery does report that Ben Cullen, a close friend of Rife's who worked in the lab, discussed at length the Fishbein conspiracy, a discussion that was recorded on tape. Furthermore, Cullen's account was corroborated by Rife's associate Henry Seiner, by Rife himself, and later by Rife's attorney, Bertrand Comparet. Apparently, Fishbein had heard about Rife from a man with malignant tumor who was cured by the Rife Ray. Through this man, Fishbein not only discovered Rife, but saw verification as to the reality and efficacy of this procedure. According to Cullen, Fishbein then dispatched 2 representatives from Los Angeles to approach Beamrays Corporation and attempt to buy into the company. Beamrays declined their offer, so Fishbein's representatives then bribed one of Reif's partners, Philip Hoyland, with $10,000 to compel him to proceed as their agent, or, as Cullen calls it, their stooge. With the assistance of high-priced lawyer, Hoyland attempted hostile takeover of Beamrays through a contrived lawsuit aimed at replacing the board of directors and positioning Hoyland and his gang as the replacements. This included conspiring with C.R. Hutchinson, a corporate entrepreneur who saw an opportunity to get rich by promoting the technology that cured cancer, to slowly freeze Reif out of their shared ownership deal. In addition, there were more deals and side deals, which split up Beamrays Corporation, even the ownership of more. The structure of the corporation was not only incredibly convoluted, but also undoubtedly illegal. Another unscrupulous act Hoyland committed was the complete redesign of the Beamray. Montgomery points out, just as Comparrot had, that the device could not be patented, for it was a variable frequency generator hooked up to a helium tube. It couldn't do anything different enough or distinct from already existing equipment to be eligible for patent consideration. It was obvious to all that the only things of value in the process they were endorsing or selling were the MOR frequencies, and they only had value if they were secret. Of course, Reif, Hoyland, and a very few trusted associates knew the frequencies, but not the company's board of directors, executive officers, or shareholders. If the frequencies were common knowledge, there was nothing to prevent others from building their own equipment. This would mean no compensation to Reif for his hard work, time, energy, and vision. Hence, Hoyland built the units so that the frequencies, as well as the methods used to generate them, were disguised. See Insert, Permutations of the Reif Ray, for more details. One might generously concede that Hoyland's redesign of the Beamray was justified, except, as Montgomery summarizes, it wasn't long before it became apparent that Hoyland's revamped design for the Beamray machine was unstable. Hoyland was constantly called upon to go to the doctor's office and fix the machine, recalibrate dial settings, service leaky tube, solve overheating issues, solve frequency drift problems. As the summer of 1938 waned, Beamrays Corporation started to become unglued. From reading the letters, transcripts, and depositions, there is a sense that a stark realization was slowly dawning upon them, both collectively and as individuals, that this hastily arranged business venture might be as inherently unstable as turning out to be. Hoyland's machines were making a bad situation even worse. Hoyland also defrauded a group of wealthy British doctors who had paid for several Ray units, but to whom he sent incompletely assembled and improperly calibrated equipment, which, as a result, did not operate correctly. Attorney Bertrand Comparrot later called it deliberate sabotage. They, Reif and his associates, wanted a saleable instrument, and Hoyland was making junk. One of the most sad and frustrating aspects of this whole situation was that Royal Reif passively allowed it to happen. Like many geniuses devoted to science, Reif refused to get involved with the business end of his beloved research. Montgomery bluntly states he could do just about anything he wanted to when it came to tinkering, building, conceptualizing, formulating, or configuring. But when it came to the art of people, Reif was a bit of dummy. Reif was the first one to admit that he was not a business person. Imagine his trepidation at having among his inventory of inventions little box that demonstrably cures cancer and any infectious disease, a thing that not only needs to be marketed, but demands it. So what did Reif do? He started giving away ownership and control of his invention in order to pass this business responsibility on to others. He signed over 55% ownership of the Beamray device to Philip Hoyland. Reif gave him a controlling interest because he felt that would provide just enough incentive to make it work. Reif's attorney at the time, the man responsible for notarizing the agreement, thought this was insanity and counseled Reif to substantially reduce Hoyland's percentage. But Reif was adamant. Hoyland had designed and built the version of the machine in question while working for Rife over the last few years for very little pay, so Rife thought it was fair. A pliable, vulnerable, and somewhat inept Dr. Rife allowed himself to be manipulated by people he trusted, including Philip Hoyland, who used him as a document-signing puppet. More Rife history, the John Hubbard interviews. In 1947, pathology student John Hubbard discovered the Journal of the Smithsonian Institute article on Rife's universal microscope. Excited, he sent letters to all the optical companies, asking if they had any information on the microscope. Not one did. Almost 30 years later, the now tenured professor of pathology at State University of New York at Buffalo read Christopher Bird's article on that same universal microscope while browsing a magazine rack. The professor contacted Christopher Bird, who fortuitously had learned the whereabouts of John Crane, an engineer who was still living and had associated with Rife during the inventor's later years. Bird was looking for an expert in microscopy and pathology to help him assess the instruments that Crane said were in his possession. So their quests merged. Hubbard and Bird began working together to unearth, examine, and, if possible, obtain a Rife microscope to satisfy Hubbard, and a beam-rays machine to satisfy Bird. From John Crane, they obtained a list of about a dozen people who were still alive and had known or worked with Rife. They traveled to San Diego, Los Angeles, Chicago, and even England. Over the course of many years, Professor Hubbard conducted most of the interviews and recorded them. Hubbard also visited the San Diego Court Records Room in 1976 and obtained microfilm of most of the 1939 beam-rays trial documents, affidavits, depositions, subpoenas, demurs, court motions. Thanks to his record-keeping and interviews on tape, along with other surviving letters and documents, the history of Royal Rife is more complete. Yee adapted from Sean Montgomery, Requiem for Royal Rife, The Hubbard Interviews Introduction, 2006. After the trial, Ben Cullen stated that Philip Hoyland had admitted to him that although he had accepted the $10,000 bribe to scuttle the whole beam-rays operation, he later was very sorry and wished to God he'd never accepted, but by then the damage to Rife was irreparable. Even though Hoyland lost the court case, and of course left the company, Beam-Rays Corporation had spent so much money on the case that it was now bankrupt. With all these crises, it's not surprising that Rife began having a problem with alcohol. Attorney Bertrand Comparet would later confirm that Rife's affinity for alcohol was catalyzed by his fear of being put on the witness stand during the trial. But after the trial ended, Rife couldn't quit. Drinking would continue to be a problem for the rest of his life. Around this time, a law was passed by the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC is responsible for granting licenses to broadcasters who meet requirements. The new law prohibited the transmission of certain RF frequencies without a license. Although the law was intended to protect radio broadcast stations and their listeners from stray RF signal interference, it also prevented Rife's therapy from being administered, since as the Rife rays relied on radio frequencies of the treatments. To comply with the new legal requirements, Rife had to completely reconfigure his units. For this new task, Rife hired Verne Thompson. Thompson was an electronics engineer with experience as a police radio repairman for the San Diego Police Department and had been doing all the repairs on the frequency devices after Beam-Rays Corporation closed. Together, in the early 1940s, the two men designed a new ray tube instrument that, although patterned after the best Beam-Rays device, was quite different. The high RF carrier waves that Rife had previously used would have interfered with radio frequencies allocated to broadcasts and other functions, so this new device utilized low frequencies Hertz audio range. It's in the unclear how the lower frequencies were determined. Even though Rife's new machine was less effective than the best of his earlier models, the systematic attempts undermine Rife continued. The American Medical Association ruled, writes Vassilatos, that no state medical society member who use of the Rife ray tube system would be permitted to continue medical practice in the United States. Morris Fishbein, extended his legal arm to inform each member of the Rife team of the impending legal process. All ray tube units would be recalled, impounded, and destroyed by federal court order, under penalty of fines and imprisonment. The AMA did as it had threatened. It applied its clout with the state medical societies to forcibly close any clinics using a ray device. Each doctor was threatened with the loss of his license and a malpractice lawsuit unless his unit was relinquished, a difficult constraint, as these doctors owned high-performance beam rays or earlier equipment. Dr. Richard Hamer, who had bought a Rife ray machine in the late 1930s, was one of the physicians who reluctantly visited an office, probably of AMA in San Diego. Dave Felt relays a conversation about that era with Dr. Hamer's son, Don. Dr. Hamer was told, "We don't know by whom, to get rid of the machine or lose his MD license." Don said that his dad was really excited and happy with the machine and that it worked extremely well, but he had to comply. Dr. James B. Cush, who had been using Rife technology in his practice for 2 decades, had his AMA membership rescinded because he, along with his colleague Dr. Yale, refused to relinquish his machine. These 2 surgeons later stated, Vassalatos reports, that for 22 years after this action, they continued to successfully treat and cure thousands of patients with the Rife ray tube devices, which they secretly maintained. Dr. Yale published a large and concise chronological account of patients treated and cured in his practice throughout that 22-year period. Notwithstanding the fact that 60% of severe cancer cases brought him were medically inoperable, incurable, and hopeless, Dr. Yale confirmed that all of these persons were yet alive and living happy, full lives. Threats and intimidation are key ploys used to coerce people into submission. However, altering the historical record is necessary too, to prevent people from realizing that times were once different or better. With their memories altered or wiped clean, people tend to remain submissive and complacent. This explains the orchestrated attempt to erode history. Vassalatos writes, Fishbein, the editor and chief censor of the AMA, saw that Rife's name would be stricken from all publications, that no professional journal would dare publish anything by Rife, and that no mention would ever be made of Rife's achievements in formal proceedings. Inescapably linked with the pharmaceutical trusts, Fishbein's actions were all too conspicuous. Permutations of the Rife ray. Royal Rife's best machines, when calibrated properly, had an almost 100% success rate in eliminating conditions ranging from staph infections to cancer. But not all of his units were successful. This has led contemporary Rife researchers to ask, what made some machines effective while others were not? And why has it been so difficult for researchers to consistently duplicate Royal Rife's promising case studies? These most questions are not merely academic, because a significant failure rate for even one serious condition may cost people their lives. Despite an impressive track record for nearly every health challenge, too often many modern units are unsuccessful when used to treat cancer. Although they work far better than chemo and radiation if only by reducing pain and improving quality of life, Rife researchers, and of course those who are ill, want and expect more. Frequency device manufacturers, hoping to duplicate Rife's formula equipment plus frequencies equal sign healing, are constantly experimenting with different designs. The major obstacle to learning the secret success has been the lack of Rife's of reliable data due to incomplete historical records. For a long time, there were tantalizing but only partial clues from Rife's surviving lab notes, decades-old correspondence, early film footage, and photographs. Then, in 2001, someone discovered many reel-to-reel audio tapes in an old trunk featuring discussions between Rife and several colleagues. The recordings were converted to CD and made available to the public. Listening to Rife and his friends discuss the equipment and case studies provided more information as to how his equipment worked, but critical information was still missing. Around the same time, what was believed to be an original beam rays machine was found in a museum and carefully dismantled by a British team that included engineers Aubrey Schoon and Stuart Andrews. Analysis showed that Royal Rife had borrowed a number of components from the work of other groundbreaking inventors, including Nikola Tesla, George Lakhovsky, perhaps Reinhold Voll, and especially Albert Abrams. But they knew that Rife's equipment had been redesigned more than 3 different times, at one point to accommodate a new FCC law regulating the use of radio frequency wavelengths. How a unit operated depended on when it had been built and who had built it. Unfortunately, existing photos did not provide enough details about the equipment to provide definitive clues, and as it turned out, this was not one of Rife's best units. The team incorrectly identified the unit and mistakenly believed that it worked when it did not. This led them to formulate plausible but wrong theories about how the machine generated frequencies. In 2004, an elderly nurse who used to work with John Marsh, a colleague of Rife's in his later years, gave boxes of valuable documents and audio tapes to U.S. researcher and frequency generator builder Jeff Garf. 3 years after, Garf and a small group YI, which included Jason Ringas of the Rife Research Group of Canada and Jim Peters, an engineer familiar with old tube technology YI, deciphered a schematic of a Beamrays Corporation instrument built by Philip Hoyland. A working model was made using antique parts that were still available. The problem was the schematic of the device was incomplete. This meant that the group could only guess how the device worked YI, and their guess, although reasonable, turned out to be incorrect. Thus, more time was spent without unearthing answers. 1 year later, in 2008, Garf located and purchased a Beamrays Instrument 1 of the original 16, built in the 1930s by Beamrays Corporation, from Dr. Larry Lowe of Toledo, Ohio. Around the same time, Steve Ross of the World Research Foundation, who had known John Crane, another colleague of Rife's in his later years, allowed Garf to scan the original 1939 Beamrays trial manuscript. As it turns out, according to Garf, the Beamrays Corporation had produced 2 different designs, the laboratory model and the clinical model. From reading the trial testimony, Garf and Peters realized that the schematic they owned belonged to the laboratory model, while the actual instrument that Garf had obtained was a clinical model. Now they had to untangle which machine was doing what. By 2010, the original Beamrays clinical model was repaired, and certain aspects were evaluated with a spectrum analyzer. The analysis disclosed that Philip Hoyland, who became Rife's engineer in 1935 with the construction of the Rife Ray Hash 4, and who in 1936 began building the Beamrays clinical model, sold by Beamrays Corporation in 1938, had deliberately obscured how the frequencies were transmitted, and consequently, what those frequencies actually were. Sean Montgomery gives an excellent description of the various ways in which some of Royal Rife's machines were altered, configured, and disguised. As time went on and different versions of the Beamray machine came out of Hoyland's workshop, it started to become something that was so technically far removed from Rife's original approach that it was, from Hoyland's perspective, debatable whether or not Rife had a stake in it anymore. Rife's old device was a big, clunky, modular contraption. Hoyland's new machines were smaller, sleeker, and portable. Hoyland combined recent advances in electronics with sophisticated circuit design, more advanced than the old-school circuitry Rife had employed. Further, on Rife's old device, the dial settings indicated the output signal indicated the frequency of, and the device itself was simply a large modular frequency generator that provided particularly high power ratings in certain high-frequency bandwidths where the MORs resided. Hoyland's new machines took the MOR frequencies and hid them within the circuitry of the machines so that the dial settings would not give the true output frequency, but an encoded numeric equivalent. The output signal on Hoyland's machines was generated by an indirect means within the machine, unlike Rife's original device, whose output signal was generated directly. In other words, Rife's old machines were designed to mainly present the frequency in question, and Hoyland's new machines were designed to mainly hide the frequency in question. This brings us to the final point of difference in the 2 machine camps. Rife's original machines were high-frequency devices. He found that the MORs for most bugs were in the radio frequency, RF range, very high. So Rife's frequency instruments were designed to provide maximum power at these higher ranges. Hoyland changed all of that, and in doing so, he messed with the frequencies. Hoyland's idea was to convert Rife's discovered MOR frequencies by translating them down to a lower frequency. The result was a whole new set of numbers, a whole new set of frequencies, a whole new set of MORs, a whole new electronic encryption method to scramble these new numbers, a whole new waveform, a whole new power signature, fundamentally different than the old one, a whole new bandwidth, a whole new approach, a whole new machine. Had Hoyland built the Beamrays Corporation devices in a straightforward way, their mode of operation would have been more easily deciphered by modern researchers. Although Hoyland did not accomplish his goal of taking over the Beamrays Corporation, he did accomplish his goal of deceiving others who would eventually try to duplicate both the original technology and the treatment successes. Along with Hoyland's deceptions, several sets of lab notes from various periods, written by a few different people, caused a great deal of confusion regarding the frequencies. The numbers for the same microorganism appeared to be recorded differently for different machines. Which one was correct? Then, there were two RF, radio frequency signals coming from a ray tube. Were there two MOR frequencies for one microbe? We do know that with tuberculosis, two MORs were needed so that both forms of the microbe were destroyed. Otherwise, the infection would return if only one form was targeted. However, generally with the two frequencies, it was difficult to tell which one was the actual MOR. And what purpose did the other signal serve? What about the effects of combining two frequencies which produced other complex sidebands? Was it one of the frequencies that existed within the sidebands that turned out to be the actual MOR of the pathogen? That may have depended on what machine was being used. Then there was the issue of the waveform. Some researchers insisted that the shape of the wave was the deciding factor in achieving better results with only certain cures. Others claimed noble gases in the plasma tube. Still others wondered whether a plasma light was needed at all. Couldn't metal electrodes contacting the body be used instead of light tube, since both appeared to function equally well as transmitters? And although some experimenters believed that an RF carrier wave was needed to drive the frequency into the body yi because otherwise the signal might not penetrate all types of bodily tissue, other experimenters obtained good results without an RF carrier wave. Considering the possible biases and preferences of the researchers, some of whom built and sold their own frequency devices, it's easy to see how someone could misinterpret the data. And what about many of the audio range, lower, frequencies that contemporary experimenters have been using for various conditions? Many of these numbers seem to work. Users report feeling better. But what is contributing to improved well-being? It's possible that in addition to, or instead of microbe devitalization yi, the body's immune response is being stimulated. Medical doctor Robert P. Stafford, a colleague of Rife's who used the technology extensively until his death, believed that some of the frequencies, rather than killing or disabling microbes, were effective because they stimulated the adrenal glands and supported immune function, which helped the client's own body fight the infection. But the shape had to be considered too. Sine waves are gentler than square waves. What effects on the body's tissue did each have, and did the different wave shapes affect microbes differently? Other factors may also explain varied responses in subjects then and now. Evidence shows that some newly emerging microbes have been genetically engineered and are hence much tougher to eliminate than their predecessors. Also, an unprecedented increase in harmful synthetic chemicals over the past 80 years has made us more susceptible to the proliferation and mutation of microbes. Dr. James Baer, inventor of the Baer-Wright device, speculates that more than microbe destruction. Once a cancer starts, does removal of the initiating microorganism cause the cancer to disappear? Rife's early philosophy was that cancer was caused by a virus. Today, we know that there are quite a few different viruses that cause cancer. For instance, the human papillomavirus, HPV, can cause cancer of the uterus, penis, ovaries, nose, esophagus, and lung. Hepatitis B and C viruses are implicated in liver cancer. The Epstein-Barr virus, various herpes viruses, and simian virus 40, SV40, are also associated with cancers. Even bacteria are not exempt. The bacterium Helicobacter pylori can cause stomach cancer. Rife reasoned that if the viruses were killed, the cells would normalize and the cancer would disappear. But by the 1950s, Rife may have believed that cancer originated from the toxic byproducts of the virus metabolism. One byproduct was identified as dibenzanthracene. Nowadays, its derivative, dimethylbenzanthracene, DMBA, a highly carcinogenic orange-brown crystalline hydrocarbon found in coal tar, is often used to induce cancer in lab animals. So what was Rife actually treating? Was he normalizing the cancerous cells? Was he killing the microbes responsible for the infection, if present? Or was he eliminating some chemical carcinogen? There is reason to assume that Rife's therapy was helping in all of the ways that Baer discusses. Cancer cells have a much lower plasma membrane potential, lower voltage than normal, non-cancerous cells, differences which are reflected in the electromagnetic EM field emitted by the signatures that they emit. The Rife ray contained many different types of wavelengths known to have a variety of effects on living tissue. This includes the normalization of cellular voltage, which corresponds to an increase of energy in the tissues. Once cellular voltage was restored, chemical carcinogens could be better eliminated because healthy cells can remove noxious waste much more easily than unhealthy cells. Not discussed by Baer, but considered by other researchers, is the likelihood that the EM field was either tapping into restorative scalar waves directly or helping the body tap into them. See elsewhere in this chapter and Chapter 4 for more information on scalar waves. There is one more area of debate within the Rife research community worth mentioning, and that is the effectiveness of electrode pad units versus ray tube, radiant plasma units. Devotees of radiant plasma units point out that Rife was not happy with the later change of design from a ray tube to electrodes, and that he could have used electrodes or a metal antenna in his initial units, but instead chose gas-filled tubes because there are many different energies, including electric and magnetic fields, that created a beneficial effect. Proponents of the electrode devices believe that as long as correct frequencies are transmitted, the benefits are the same, since people do benefit when using pad machines. From clinical trials in the U.S. and abroad, it's both methods of delivery work although unclear that most instances, with both delivery systems, it's important to use the correct frequency. We still have more to learn about how Rife's technology worked and how the therapy can be adapted for today's world. Thankfully, after many years of conjecture, trial, error, and experimentation, we are closer to knowing what made Royal Rife's best machines so successful. Corruption has many faces. Alfred Sloan and Charles Kettering, the founders of the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center of New York City, had long and prosperous careers at General Motors, the car manufacturer. Although Kettering discovered that adding grain alcohol to gasoline would boost mileage, eliminate knocking in the engine, and limit poisonous fuel emissions, he later abandoned this high-performance gasoline formula in favor of inferior-performing lead additives that every industry mogul knew were highly toxic. Summarized from The Secret History of Lead, The Nation, March 20, 2000. Barry Lines recounts similar reports. 20 years after the historic 1931 dinner honoring Kendall, and some of the attendees denied that the universal Rife microscope worked, that they had been present at the dinner, or that they even knew Rife. Considering that some of these professionals were publicly quoted in newspapers and magazines as having worked side by side with Rife, and that a photograph taken of the banquet distributed, their denials attendees had been publicly seem astonishing. However, this illustrates the degree of intimidation involved. One can only imagine how Rife must have felt after being betrayed by some of his formerly supportive colleagues. Consider Arthur Kendall, who isolated and noted pleomorphic characteristics of typhoid bacillus with Rife and then published a paper on their findings. After retiring to Mexico in 1942, He wrote to the California Department Health that his contact with Rife had been very limited. And Alvin Food of the Pasadena General Hospital, who did the pathology tests for Dr. Johnson during the 1934 clinical trials, later denied his involvement. With support from the Fishbein backers, the allopathically oriented American Medical Association, the American Cancer Society, and Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute in New York City, began a heavily organized public mudslinging attack on Rife and his colleagues. Sloan Kettering specialized then, as now, in treating cancer with radiation and chemo. It had, and continues to have, administrative ties to the American Cancer Society. See sidebar, corruption has many faces. Executives from the Rockefeller Foundation, who were friends with the chief administrators of the AMA, also denounced Rife and his technology. Virtually all of the establishments that attacked Rife were partially funded by or connected to the pharmaceutical industry. Organized meetings were held in which doctors who had never even looked at microbes through the universal microscope condemned Rife's research, the frequency therapy, and the doctors who used the technology. Rife supporters were blasted by the press, professionally and personally intimidated, and threatened with the loss of their practitioner licenses. Royal Rife's laboratory was raided. Photographs, medical records, reports, pieces of the universal microscope, including some very expensive hand-cut quartz prisms, and other valuable equipment were stolen. The abundant funding and resources that had been Rife's in the 1930s were no longer available, making the mass production of a high-powered Rife ray no longer feasible. It was during, and despite this time of intense AMA intimidation and harassment, that Dr. Raymond E. Seidel and M. Elizabeth Winter managed to publish their article on the new microscopes in the February 1944 issue of the Journal of the Franklin Institute. However, this article's publication was an exception. Despite the prestige of Rife's defenders and the hundreds of articles that had appeared in newspapers and journals like Scientific American, the July 13, 1932, proceedings of the staff meetings of the Mayo Clinic, and publications of the Franklin Institute and the Smithsonian Institution, after the mid-1940s, most positive publicity for Rife had dissipated. Furthermore, publications containing articles on the universal microscope were disappearing from archives and libraries. As late as 1986, Steve Ross of the World Research Foundation stated that no references could be found in the U.S. to either Rife or his microscope in any of the 350 electronic databases that the organization was using at that time. Those who insist that they surely would have heard of Rife and his inventions, had they been any good, need only observe the methods used to suppress his work. If supporters of Rife could draw their support be pressured enough to with and financial backing, and even deny knowing him, imagine what the general public, which had no first-hand experience of the man or his inventions, could be induced to think. Then, in October 1944, a different kind of tragedy struck. According to coroner's report secured by Dave Felt, Milbank Johnson died of rupture in his heart right before his 73rd birthday. Even though the friendship between Johnson and Rife had become so strained that they had not spoken to each other in 7 years, Johnson had still been friend, sponsor, and champion. To Rife, losing Milbank Johnson may also have felt like losing a vital connection to a better past. Rife continued to drink to relieve his stress. There was simply too much money invested in allopathic drugs and its affiliate businesses, doctoring, hospital care, anesthesiology, surgical supplies to a non-invasive modality to be widely utilized. If the universal microscope did in fact clearly show the response of microorganisms to their environment, it would be easy enough to test whether or not the Rife ray worked. But if the frequency therapy worked, then expensive drugs and other allopathic treatments might become less necessary, even obsolete. The logical way to rebalance the system would be through holistic dietary and lifestyle changes rather than from the ingestion of poisonous medications. And then, allopathic medicine could be rejected as the main, or only, healing modality. To be fair, Not everyone in the medical community who opposed Rife's technology was motivated by greed. A sizable number of doctors had trouble accepting the fact that microbes could be seen live through the universal microscope. It had never been done before. Also, live meant that these minuscule creatures could do some pretty amazing things like change their form, size, function, and even virulence. If microbes transform and their transformation was based on the terrain in which they lived, this did more than put the responsibility of healing back into the hands of the sick. It meant that cherished beliefs were invalid, despite hard data that contradicted those beliefs. To those whose identities were based on certain beliefs, pleomorphism not only seemed like science fiction, but it threatened their sense of self. A few doctors knew or had heard of colleagues who'd looked through the universal microscope and had seen what Rife saw, but they were still skeptical. Now, it's understandable if one cannot accept favorable second-hand reports from even highly respected colleagues. After all, empirical evidence is much more convincing and more scientific. However, it's harder to fathom the fear of researchers and doctors who refuse to even look through the microscope. One would think that they'd want every tool available to help the people they said they were serving. There was yet another category of professionals, those who looked through the microscope and did not see the microbes at all. How could this be? Linus analogizes their lack of ability to the reactions of the Fuegan natives who were met by the explorer Magellan. When Magellan's expeditions first landed at Tierra del Fuego, the Fuegans, who for centuries had been isolated with their canoe culture, were unable to see the ships anchored in the bay. The big ships were so far beyond their experience that, despite their bulk, the horizon continued unbroken. The ships were invisible. This was learned on later expeditions to the area when the Fuegans described how, according to one account, the shaman had first brought to the villagers' attention that the strangers had arrived in something which, although preposterous beyond belief, could actually be seen if one looked carefully. We ask, how could they not see the ships? They were so obvious, so real. Yet others would ask how we cannot see things just as obvious. Vassilados's explanation is not psychological, but monetary. He points out the clear opposition from RCA, the manufacturer of the competing electron microscope. Regardless of why others failed to see what Royal Rife and his enlightened contemporaries saw, the outcome was the same. For Rife, to fall from a position of being respected and praised to being ridiculed and ignored, not to mention being betrayed by friends, and seeing decades of work pilfered and destroyed, was more than he could bear. By 1950, he was drinking daily. He still conducted some experiments, wrote, and was contacted by professionals and a few friends. But the vital foundation of his work was no longer there. Later, in October of 1957, his wife Mamie died, another very traumatic event. Pleomorphism as a global phenomenon. Ironically, an internet search reveals at least 8 heavily documented textbooks on pleomorphism published in German, complete with references and photos. In the United States, the existence of pleomorphism is still debated. However, some U.S. medical sources, especially the older ones, don't mention pleomorphism. Tabor's Cyclopedic Medical Dictionary, first copyright 1940, defines pleomorphism as 1. Property of crystallizing into 2 or more different forms. 2. Occurrence of more than one form in a life cycle. And Harrison's Principles of Internal Medicine, one of 2 major textbooks used by medical students, states that Acinetobacter calcoaceticus was described by Debord as Mima polymorpha in 1939. It is one of 2 well-characterized varieties of Acinetobacter. Organisms described as Bacterium anitratum and B5W are synonymous with Acinetobacter. These organisms are pleomorphic, gram-negative, encapsulated, and non-modal. They grow well on ordinary media, forming white, convex, smooth colonies. Diplococcal forms predominate in colonies grown on solid media. Rods and filamentous forms are more common in liquid media. It's indeed puzzling why more people in the medical community haven't paid attention to routine research that was conducted by their own respected microbiology specialists. John Crane, John Marsh, and the next generation of frequency devices. Several years prior to Mamie's death, when Rife was selling, piece by piece, his remaining equipment to pay for food, he met John Crane. Crane did not compensate Rife nearly enough for the equipment that he bought, but he did take Rife and Mamie into his home. Then, in 1953, another key player in the Rife SAG appeared, John Marsh. Marsh had recently moved to San Diego to obtain treatments for his wife, who had cancer. However, her doctors said that there was nothing they could do for what they believed was a terminal condition. When Marsh was assigned as supervisor to John Crane at their workplace, Convair Aeronautics, Crane told Marsh about Rife. After considerable persuasion, Rife gave them an old beam raise instrument, which they repaired. Marsh's wife was cured after 6 treatments. The beam raise unit, while it benefited the Marshes, could not be used for the general public in 1953 unless I was updated and assigned a new FCC license. If Rife's technology was to survive, the 1930s instrument had to be equipped with newer electronic components that would make it not only accessible to the average person, more portable, affordable, and easy to use, but also legal. Thus, a friendship began between these 3 men that would last for years, writes Jeff Garf. Rife, John Crane, and John Marsh worked together as a team in the 1950s and early 60s. They formed a company called Life Labs and started building Dr. Rife's frequency instruments. 67. Vern Thompson was hired by Life Labs to make their equipment. Thompson updated the audio frequency instrument he had built around 1942, and in 1953, the AZ-58 was launched. The AAZ-58, also a ray tube instrument, transmitted frequencies in the Hertz range and did not interfere with radio broadcasts. The wave shape A was a square wave, literally squared off and flat on top, as compared to rounded sine wave, and containing odd-numbered harmonics. To a limited extent, these harmonics can produce effects similar to those of a higher frequency sine wave. However, after about the 9th harmonic, the power is so weak that the signal is no longer effective in devitalizing pathogens. Life Labs, writes Garf, lowered the audio frequencies by a factor of 10 and changed them from sine wave to a square wave form. John Crane said this is when square wave the instruments started to work better. It is ironic that they had to use a square wave that produces harmonics in order to get the instrument to even begin to give them any results. Garf believes that Marsh and Crane not only regarded the lower frequencies as Rife's intellectual property, but also considered the AZ-58 instrument, citing as evidence a plaque to be Rife's on the front of the device with Rife's name on it. This may be an optimistic misinterpretation, however. During an interview in the 1970s, Comparet stated quite clearly that Rife had expressed displeasure with the AZ-58 and indignantly denied that Crane was still using the Rife principle as the unit had undergone too many radical changes. We know that the AZ-58 did no harm, but the all-important question is, did it heal? Physician Robert P. Stafford, who spent many hours with the AZ-58 from 1957 to 1962, faithfully recorded its performance. He was pleased that the AZ-58 worked very well for most health conditions. However, it did not substantially help people with cancer. Dr. Stafford wrote, "As yet, we have failed to cure any case of advanced terminal malignancy. It appears in several instances that we may have impressed the disease favorably, but only temporarily." Meanwhile, more legal trouble was brewing in 1958. The state of California Public Health Department compelled Crane to attend a hearing to discuss the shortcomings of the AZ-58. Although the unit had been independently tested by Palo Alto Detection Lab, Kalbfeld Lab, UCLA Medical Lab, and San Diego Testing Lab YI, all of which verified that the equipment did not emit harmful radiation, this did not prevent the state from bringing Crane and Marsh to trial in spring 1961 on charges of medical misconduct. Comparet would later comment on the tactics used to entrap the 2 men. When anybody is apparently giving the medical monopoly a hard time, they go after him. they hired some harmless-looking housewives who were fitted with wireless microphones, and down at the end of the block, here were the Californial state men in a van with their recording equipment taking it down. Remember one tape? Here was Marsh in his own voice, clear as could be, saying, "This instrument will not only cure every known disease, it'll cure some we haven't yet discovered." To be fair to Marsh, John Crane was making the same type of claims, but he just didn't get caught. Compare It also, however, described how Crane risked breaking the law to help others. The customers of Crane and Marsh, he said, were ignorant people. You couldn't simply hand them the instrument and tell them, "Go home and use it." They didn't have brains enough. So Crane went there with his instrument and operated the thing himself to make sure it would be done correctly. One customer was a woman whose condition markedly improved until finally they, presumably her doctors, told her she should go to the county hospital and get a blood transfusion, and she came back from that worse in shape and died a week or so in very much later. Crane, had to admit on the stand that he and Marsh had gone there and operated the instrument to give the treatment, and neither of them had an MD license. That's why John Crane served his time. As for Royal Rife, he was now almost 73 years old, and in no state to endure the stress and indignity of another trial. He secluded himself in Mexico and refused to come to the U.S. as a witness. No notarized medical reports in favor of the frequency instrument were allowed at the trial, either from physicians or from those they treated. Rife's own written testimony, in the form of answers to questions posed by Crane's lawyer, was not introduced into the record because, Compare It later explained, Rife understandably refused to come and testify in court. It's worth noting that Crane had previously invited numerous governmental agencies and private organizations to test the AZ-58. Among those he contacted were the United States Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the National Research Council Committee on Growth, the American Cancer Society, the Damon Runyon Fund, Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute in New York City, and the International Cancer Clinic. But no one expressed interest. Rife had strong feelings about this. "The American Cancer Society," he wrote in the document submitted to but not accepted by the court, "was interested until they found out that John Crane and I are not medical doctors, and then they called John Crane from New York and stated that they had decided to cancel the proposed project, which would have shown them how to isolate the virus, make it virulent, grow the cancer tumors, and how to electronically eliminate the cancer." One can only imagine his frustration as he continued. "They spend millions on drugs but nothing on electronics, unless it will supplement drugs like X-ray and radioactive treatments, which put terrible scar tissue and burns inside the body. And then the person has to have a great amount of dope and painkillers to keep the pain down. The drug racketeer makes $10 billion annually on cancer alone. This was in the 1950s, and with this money they have been able to have an unconstitutional law put on the books, which stated that people will only be treated for cancer by medical doctors with X-ray, radioactive treatments, and surgery, creating drug monopoly to kill cancer slowly. Except for the few labs that had tested the device solely to make sure it did no harm, no organization, hospital, clinic, or medical society ever tested the units on human beings. The only medical opinion represented at the trial was from a doctor who had been given a frequency instrument to test 2 months previously and decided that it didn't work, even though he admitted in court that he had never tested or evaluated it. The jury was comprised of people with no medical background, except for the foreman who was an allopathic doctor opposed to the entire concept of frequency therapy. The AMA board, under the Director of Public Health, declared the frequency instrument unsafe and banned it from the market. Both Marsh and Crane served 3 years of jail time and were released in 1964 with orders not to associate with one another. But the AZ-58 refused to die. Just before Crane's incarceration, he and Marsh reconstructed the device so it transmitted frequencies via electrodes rather than the more expensive gas-filled glass tube. A common, off-the-shelf audio frequency generator costing around $200 was used to produce the frequencies, since it's easier and cheaper to buy a mass-produced item than to build something from individual parts. This new device had no RF carrier. It utilized square waves and frequencies in the Hertz range. John Marsh continued to build both pad and ray tube instruments until his death in 1987. However, his activities were not as widely publicized as Crane's. After his release from prison, Crane did a brisk business selling electrode units. Noted for his tendencies toward hyperbole, he claimed benefits from this new device that seemed to rival, if not surpass, results achieved by Rife's original unit. This new machine was touted as successful in treating chronic bladder irritation, cataracts, fungal growths on the hands, growths over the eyes, anal fissures, pyorrhea, arthritis, ulcerated colon, varicose veins, prostate troubles, colitis, pains in the back, and heart attacks. Crane also wrote lengthy creative manual on how to use Rife therapy with pad devices and included the additional elements of polarity, color, and magnetism. Thanks to this new pad device, a new generation of Rifers emerged. But Crane's units were expensive. An engineer friend of mine who bought a unit from Crane shortly before Crane's death concluded that it was an ordinary audio frequency generator, standard equipment in many labs. Crane had modified it with a new front panel, a simple power booster, and a few dollars worth of handheld metal cylinders to use as electrodes. This new equipment, called in some circles the Rife Crane device, or simply the Crane device, sold for 5 times its original cost. Politely put, this was not Rife's technology at its finest, either in design or intent. However, the Crane devices provided a valuable function. They helped keep the technology alive. If there was a chance that this technology was valid, then successful versions of it might be reconstructed. Royal Rife died in 1971. John Marsh died in 1987, and John Crane died in 1995. Fortunately, Rife's technology did not die with them. A new phase of this research was about to begin, the modern pleomorphism era. A fascinating obituary of medical doctor Ludwig Gross appeared in an August 1999 issue of the New York Times. The article discussed the viral nature of cancer because Gross had won an Albert and Mary Lasker Foundation Prize in 1974 for his discovery that leukemia can be transmitted by a virus. Gross had written in a 1978 article in the Cancer Research Journal that for many years there was considerable reluctance and often even frank hostility on the part of leading investigators to accept, as facts, these new and fundamental observations. As Gross later explained, research projects and experimental approaches radically different from such accepted concepts or theories were not only frowned upon, but often resulted in the refusal of the necessary financial and logistical support needed by the investigator to carry out his proposed studies. The author of the obituary reports that, for the half-century before Dr. Gross's discovery, scientists had largely ignored the role of viruses in cancer, even though, beginning in 1908, researchers had suggested a viral cause by transmitting leukemia and sarcomas in chickens. Thus, scientists have known for a century that pleomorphism plays a role in cancer and other illnesses. Following are some highlights on subsequent researchers who foundation essentially the same phenomenon. Virginia Livingston Wheeler. In the 1940s, physician Virginia Livingston Wheeler discovered a bacterium she named progenitor cryptocides, Greek for the hidden killer. A specific class of microorganism apparently belonging to the Mycobacterium has been observed and is grown from the cancerous blood and tissues of human beings and animal, she wrote. They, the microbes, are filterable and pleomorphic. The various diseases associated with this family of microbes included scleroderma, interstitial myocarditis, fibrosis, pleurisy, pericarditis, rheumatic fever, nephritis, hepatitis, and arthritis, depending on the degree of host resistance, the invasiveness of the specific microorganisms, the strain specificity, and the site of tissue susceptibility. These findings, notes dermatologist and cancer researcher Alan Cantwell, angered cancer experts, microbiologists, and American Cancer Society spokespersons, all of whom continued to insist the cancer microbe did not exist. Livingston Wheeler maintained that this pathogen is normally present in humans and animals, but causes cancer when the immune function is not working properly. She also recognized that immunity is compromised by exposure to chemical toxins, emotional stress, and poor diet. In 1953, Dr. Livingston Wheeler presented her discoveries to the 6th International Congress of Microbiology in Rome. After the seminar, the New York Academy of Medicine immediately issued a statement discounting her findings. Dr. Cornelius P. Rhodes, the head of Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, stopped all funding for the Rutgers Presbyterian Hospital laboratory, where Dr. Livingston Wheeler had worked. Significantly, when Livingston Wheeler spoke in July 1958 at the First International Congress of Microbiology and Leukemia in Antwerp, Belgium, she discovered that the pleomorphism of cancer was widely accepted in Europe, even while being ignored in the U.S. Then, in 1959, the California-based Dr. Livingston Wheeler met her neighbor, Royal Raymond Rife. Livingston Wheeler arranged for the Institute of Cancer Research in Philadelphia to provide Rife with mice, and for about a year the two worked together. Although they held similar views on pleomorphism, Dr. Livingston Wheeler focused on developing a serum instead of working with Rife's technology. In her San Diego, California clinic, people were treated with diet, supplements, and a vaccine prepared from their own diseased tissue. Dr. Livingston Wheeler died in 1990, but before her death, she expanded her research with 3 other remarkable women. See below. Eleanor Alexander Jackson. In her lab at Cornell University, microbiologist Eleanor Alexander Jackson had discovered pleomorphism in the tuberculosis bacillus, watching it change shape and size. In 1948, Dr. Alexander Jackson met Dr. Livingston Wheeler. Together, they found a special acid-fast stain that highlighted the microbe so it could be recognized in a petri dish culture and inside of a cancer tumor. At the time, the way to differentiate a virus from bacillus, bacterium, was to try to pass it through a special filter. Tiny viruses could pass through the filter, whereas the larger bacteria could not. The two researchers found that the acid-fast organisms found in scleroderma, leprosy, tuberculosis, and cancer could change from small forms that could be filtered to large forms that could not be filtered. This could only mean that the viruses morphed into bacteria and the bacteria morphed into viruses. What science had carefully cataloged as separate and discrete pathogens were, in actuality, the same microbe-changing form. It is these changes in shape and form, and thus function, that cause the different symptoms we call disease. In 1966, Drs. Livingston Wheeler and Alexander Jackson presented a paper at a seminar in Arizona sponsored by the American Cancer Society. When Alexander Jackson returned to her laboratory at Columbia University after the seminar, she found that she had been fired from her research position. Irene Corey Diller. Around the same time, cellular biologist Irene Corey Diller, a stellar employee at the Institute for Cancer Research in Philadelphia, became famous for discovering and isolating fungus-like microbes in cancer cells. She published Studies of Fungoid Form Found in Malignancy in 1953. Now the team numbered 3. Once joined by Livingston Wheeler and Alexander Jackson, Diller worked with mice specially bred for a tendency to develop cancer. After injecting healthy mice with cancerous microbes cultured from tumors taken from human breasts and other areas, she more than doubled the rate of cancer in the mice. From these cancer tumors in the mice, she then successfully cultured the same microbe, thus proving that these bacteria were involved in the development of cancer. Utilizing Livingston's methods, Diller also grew the microbe from the blood of human beings with cancer. Florence Siebert. Born in October 1897, chemist Florence Siebert was considered one of the foremost authorities on the chemistry and immunology of the acid-fast bacteria that cause tuberculosis. In the 1920s, Dr. Siebert had devised a method to make intravenous transfusions safe by eliminating contaminating bacteria. She was heavily decorated. The Trudeau Medal, the highest prize given for tuberculosis research was given to her by the National Tuberculosis Association in 1938 for perfecting the skin test for tuberculosis, used worldwide. In 1942, she received the Garvin Medal from the American Chemical Society, and in 1990, she was inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame. In 1959, Seibert retired. However, she was so impressed with Diller's research that she began working again in the early 1960s to help prove that bacteria cause cancer. Dr. Cantwell, who befriended all 4 women and considers them mentors for his own research, reports, experiments conducted by Seibert and her research team were able to isolate bacteria from every piece of tumor and every acute leukemic blood they studied, proving these acid-fast and TB-like cancer microbes were not laboratory contaminants. In her autobiography, Pebbles on the Hill of a Scientist, published privately in 1968, she wrote, "One of the most interesting properties of these bacteria is their great pleomorphism. For example, they readily change their shape from round kochi to elongated rods, and even to thread-like filaments, depending upon what medium they grow on and how long they grow. This may be one of the reasons why they have been overlooked or considered to be heterogeneous contaminants. And even more interesting than this is the fact that these bacteria have a filterable form in their life cycle. That is, that they can become so small that they pass through bacterial filters which hold back bacteria." Seibert's research, like the experiments of others before her, clearly pointed to the ambiguous boundaries between presumed discrete pathogens. Seibert's provocative papers, some emanating from the prestigious annals of the New York Academy of Sciences, should have caused a stir, Cantwell comments. But with these 4 women slowly closing in on the infectious cause of cancer, funds from previous supporters, such as the American Cancer Society, suddenly dried up. After Seibert's death, the obituaries mentioned her contributions to the safety of intravenous fluids and her great achievement with the TB skin test, but not a word was written about her cancer microbe research, to which she devoted the last 30 years of her life. Dr. Seibert died in 1991, bewildered by the medical industry's lack of interest in finding the cure for cancer. She wrote, "It is very difficult to understand the lack of interest instead of great enthusiasm that should follow such results." 92. Difficult indeed. One author reports that in 1985, the Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute found the Rife-Livingston-EAT organism, virus, in all blood cultures of cancer patients. They concluded that the organism came from outside contamination and buried the report. Lida Matman. In 1997, American biology professor and microbiologist Lida Matman was nominated for a Nobel Prize for her work on stealth pathogens. With 35 years of experience working in the fields of immunology, microbiology, bacteriology, virology, and pathology at various schools and institutions, Matman was well qualified. Her specialty was Borrelia burgdorferi, one of the pathogens involved in Lyme disease, and a microbe that she clearly stated is pleomorphic. In her definitive textbook, Cell Wall Deficient Forms, Stealth Pathogens, Matman described how Borrelia burgdorferi can survive and spread without having a cell wall. In this state, as a cell wall deficient bacterium, it is quite dangerous because the body, and antibiotics, cannot detect it. Nevertheless, Dr. Matman was able to culture the Lyme bacterium from its cell wall deficient form and grow it into spirochetes in a laboratory. Gaston Naessens, contemporary French microbiologist who now resides in Quebec, Canada, Gaston Naessens has designed an unusual and powerful microscope called a somatoscope. This device uses polarized light from an ultraviolet source and magnifies live specimens up to 30,000 diameters their size instead of the usual 2,500 diameters. As did his predecessors, Naessens has seen tiny entities in the blood, which he calls somatids. By now, you can guess the rest of they. Naessens has reported seeing 16 somatid cycles. The first 3 cycles are normal. If the system becomes unbalanced, the somatids evolve into any of 13 other stages of bacterial, viral, or fungal forms. Nasens links these pathogenic somatid forms with host of degenerative diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, cancer, AIDS, lupus, and multiple sclerosis. He can successfully predict which disease condition will develop according to which microorganisms are the most prevalent in the blood. To combat cancer, Nasens invented a holistic product called 714X. Still used today, it contains camphor, derived from the shrub Cinnamomum camphora, ammonium chloride, ammonium nitrate, sodium chloride, ethanol, and water. Every day, the 714X is injected into the lymph node in the groin. One round of treatment consists of 21 daily injections, with 3 series the minimum amount required. Most people need to receive longer-term treatment. The 714X injections appear to mobilize immune response and unclog the lymph system. Thus, it is the body that kills the cancerous tissue. Nasens' injections are available in Canada, Mexico, and Western Europe. They are used worldwide because they are successful. Because of his work, Nasens has been callously persecuted by the medical pharmaceutical establishment. Kurt Ulbrich and Bernhard Muschlien. German engineer Kurt Ulbrich left career as, in 1972, research analysts in one of the top the plastics industry formed the Institute for Interdisciplinary Basic Research. At the Institute, Mr. Ulbrich's services provided services for various industries and research organizations, using, among other tools, a microscope. But the scientist's research was hindered. It was the same old story. Existing light microscopes could not provide the resolution and image quality he needed for his work. So Ulbrich began to investigate why the resolution and depth of field of existing light microscopes were so limited. In 1976, after extensive research, Ulbrich discovered a new way of building microscopes. By using unique mathematical approach to optics, he avoided the constraints of existing optical theory and built a microscope with a resolution better than 100 nanometers and with unparalleled depth of field, full contour sharpness, and true, vivid colors. Like Reif's universal microscope, Ulbrich's invention allowed long-term viewing of microbes in their living natural state. There was never a need to kill the specimen, stain it, or use oil immersion. Ulbrich's equipment worked on different principles than Reif's microscope. As a result, it had even greater resolution and was very easy to operate. Ulbrich named the initial microscope and its successors the ergonom. In 2002, the first instrument that Ulbrich designed for sale was actively marketed by Greyfield Optical Inc., a company with bases in the United States and Europe. Later, Ulbrich created a more affordable series of microscopes with the same ease of use, field, variable color, variable depth of contrast, and an excellent optical resolution. Today, at the Institute for Basic Interdisciplinary Research, Kurt Ulbrich continues to do research and analysis, this time with the benefits of his own tool. The ergonom has been used to conduct a detailed analysis of Legionnaire's disease, leading to several published articles. The well-known German natural health practitioner Bernhard Muschlien, in conjunction with Ulbrich, has also utilized the ergonom microscope to provide foundational material for his published articles on pleomorphism and also for his film, Symbiosis or Parasitism. For contact company information, including access to the articles and film, see the resource appendix. As might be expected, the ergonom is being productively used in cancer research. Ulbrich has extensive experience observing the blood of people with various stages of cancer and those whose blood indicates a precancerous condition. Some of the images and material in the widely read German medical textbook, Pleomorphism, published by Haug Verlag, are based on Ulbrich's observations through the ergonom. In his series of drawings, see insert pages, the Ulbrich sanguinogram, Ulbrich has standardized the measurements, in nanometers, of morphing biological life forms that live in the blood. The scientist describes the oncogenous blood parasite as a cancer virus, a term he chose because it appears to be a virus-like organism, even though most forms are fungal. While his observations might appear radical to an uninformed American lay and professional audience, the majority of German practitioners and laypersons have known about pleomorphism for a long time and welcome his research. Peter Walker, a European-based Rife researcher and personal friend of Ulbrich, points out some little-known facts about the way viruses appear under an electron microscope. His account provides an excellent reason to use a microscope that does not kill its specimens when assessing the blood. Under an electron microscope, viruses not only die, they also shrivel up like a fist's, so what you see is not what viruses normally look like. For example, textbooks teach that the HIV virus is about 30 to 40 nanometers, because that is the size as seen under the electron microscope. But in reality, such viruses can grow to nearly 300 nanometers when seen in their living state, a fact established during a trial in Berlin using the ergonom microscopes. Thanks to Mr. Ulbrich's perseverance and inventiveness, researchers in many fields can now investigate life in ways that previously had not seemed possible. The arenas in which the ergonom can be utilized appear unlimited: medicine, biology, biochemistry, geology, electronics, archaeology, and electromedicine. Implications for healing. Sincere professionals in the scientific and medical arenas can no longer dispute the findings of Royal Rife and others. Finally, Rife's experiments can be taken to new level. Dr. Alan Cantwell, who studied with Dr. Mattman, as well as Drs. Livingston Wheeler, Alexander Jackson, and Diller, and who did not even have access to the ergonom when he did his experiments, flatly states, "From my work at the VA hospital with Eugenia Craggs, a microbiologist specializing in tuberculosis, I learned one important thing: microbes change form. Sometimes they appear one way, sometimes another. And they could fool the experts. The appearance of the microbe depended on what it was fed in the laboratory." In the textbooks of microbiology, the classification of organisms was simple and straightforward. But in reality, it was not that way at all. When dealing with a live person or animal, the appearance of a microbe likewise depends on the terrain inside the body. And that terrain depends on what the host has eaten. Changing the terrain not only changes the characteristics of a microbe, but in most cases determines whether the microbe will even exist. I began this chapter by describing the two radically different concepts of illness and disease. You have seen how unscientific ideas become embedded in public consciousness to such a degree that they eventually are cited as proof, despite their lack of scientific validity. So it is with the medical community's devotion to monomorphism. As long as organized medicine continues to insist that this is the only correct view of how illness is caused, advancement of holistic concepts will be suspended. However, once a medical paradigm includes the existence of pleomorphism, a true revolution in healthcare can take place. Instead of taking the latest and more poisonous drugs, people will embrace their need to change what they eat and drink and how they live. They will take responsibility to heal themselves directly instead of giving away discernment and autonomy to an outside authority. Since the first edition of this book was published, I have received thousands of phone calls, letters, and emails from people from all over the world. In most cases, they were not only willing, but eager to take responsibility for their own healing. Quite a number of correspondents were doctors and scientists, ready to act as healing facilitators and investigators rather than as unquestioned and inflexible authority figures. The new paradigm of medicine cannot be stopped and or suppressed any longer. People are waking up hungry to learn the truth. Not only is the lay public becoming more discriminating in their choices of healing modalities, but they are also actively seeking out many types of electromedicine modalities, including the technology that Rife created. Worldwide, there are many hundreds of different frequency devices being used for therapy. Not only are more companies producing electromedical equipment, but private experimenters are building their own. Although Royal Raymond Rife was the only person who ever constructed a real Rife machine, this does not mean that modern units don't work. They do. With the rapid increase of modern infectious and degenerative diseases, researchers are working harder than ever to construct units with more successful track records based on the principles that Rife discovered. In Europe and other parts of the world, frequency therapy is being used openly by many clinics and doctors due to a relatively enlightened understanding of medicine and correspondingly liberal laws. In North America, however, the manufacturers and sellers of frequency devices are not allowed to make medical claims for them. And media silence about this technology, at least in most American mainstream newspapers, magazines, and television, makes it difficult to obtain information on frequency healing unless the seeker is very determined and / or has internet access. Nevertheless, this situation is changing. The general public is more aware of Royal Rife now than they were even 5 years ago. Also, larger numbers of people are becoming interested in alternative healing methods. That is, to the allopathic medicines that have been pushed onto us like any other consumer item. The more we take responsibility to educate ourselves, the less satisfied we are likely to be with the status quo. This is as it should be. Every person has the right to choose how they want to heal. We have seen that it is more accurate to view diseases as symptom pictures than as discrete entities. Chapter 5 explains how these symptom pictures are organized in a user-friendly manner so you can make the best frequencies. But before we get there, it's use of the important that you know what to do when all those pathogens start to die in system. In the next chapter, which discusses your complementary therapies that are compatible with Rife technology, you will learn how to treat your body as a valued friend.